I'm Marcus Rodriguez, 28, a combat medic who spent 3 tours in Afghanistan while my family back home called me just a grunt. For years, I endured their dismissive comments about my military service, their subtle jokes about my simple career choice, and their constant comparisons to my brother's corporate success. At family gatherings, I was the afterthought, the one who couldn't cut it in the real world. But last month, when my commanding officer stood before my entire family, at my homecoming celebration, his words changed everything. "This man," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and respect, "saved my life and the lives of 12 other soldiers during an ambush in Kandahar. He's not just a grunt, he's a hero." The stunned silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face went pale, my father's proud smile faltered, and my brother, he couldn't even look me in the eye. What happened next would shatter their perception of me forever, and force them to confront the truth about the son and brother they'd dismissed for far too long. Growing up in the Rodriguez household meant living in the shadow of that perfection had a name: David, my older brother by 3 years. David was everything my parents had dreamed of in a son. While I struggled through high school with a solid C average, David graduated valedictorian. While I played JV football and barely made the team, David was captain of the debate team, student council president, and already being courted by Ivy League schools. The Harvard MBA diploma still hangs in our living room, positioned prominently above the fireplace where everyone can see it. It's been there for 5 years now, and my mother still points it out to every visitor who walks through the door. "That's our David," she'd say with a pride that made my chest tight. "Vice President of Strategic Development at Morrison & Associates. He's being considered for partner, you know." I remember the day that diploma arrived. David had graduated summa cum laude naturally, and my parents threw a party that lasted 3 days. Relatives flew in from across the country, neighbors stopped by with congratulations, and the local newspaper even ran a small feature about local boy makes good. Meanwhile, I was 17 flunking calculus, and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. The comparisons started early, and never stopped. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" became the soundtrack of my teenage years. When David got accepted to Harvard, I got suspended for fighting. When David made Dean's List, I was repeating algebra. When David brought home his first serious girlfriend, a fellow MBA student with impeccable manners and a trust fund, I was dating Sarah Chen, whose biggest crime was working at the local diner. While putting herself through community college, my parents never said they loved David more. They didn't have to. It was written in every proud smile, every bragging phone call to relatives, every time they forgot to mention my achievements, few as they were, while spending 20 minutes detailing David's latest promotion or recognition. The breaking point came during my senior year. I'd been accepted to the local state university. Nothing fancy, but I was proud. I'd even managed to bring my grades up to a B average. When I told my parents at dinner, expecting some small measure of pride, my father barely looked up from his plate. "That's nice, Marcus," he said, cutting his steak with methodical precision. "David called earlier. He's been offered a position at Goldman Sachs for after graduation. Starting salary is more than I make after 20 years. That was it. No congratulations, no acknowledgement of my improvement, no recognition that I'd worked hard to turn my grades around. Just another opportunity to remind me how I measured up to my brother. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I walked into the Army recruiting office the next morning and signed up for a delayed entry program. I told myself it was about serving my country, about finding my purpose, about becoming a man. But deep down I knew the truth. I was running away from a family that had already decided I wasn't worth their time. When I told my parents, the reaction was exactly what I expected. My mother cried, not from pride, but from disappointment. My father looked at me like I'd just told him I was dropping out of school to become a street performer. "The military," he said, the word dripping with disdain. "Marcus, this isn't the 1940s. Smart young men don't throw their lives away in the service anymore. They get educated, they build careers, they contribute to society." "Like David," I said, quietly. "Yes, like David." He didn't even try to soften it. "Your brother is building something meaningful with his life. This," he waved his hand dismissively, "this is just you running away from responsibility." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was running away. But I was 18 years old, tired of being the disappointment, tired of living up to expectations I could never meet. The military promised structure, purpose, a chance to prove myself in ways that had nothing to do with test scores or college applications. That as I sat in that recruiting office, signing papers that would send me to basic training in 3 months, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maybe I couldn't be David. Maybe I'd never make my parents proud the way he did. But maybe, just maybe, I could find a place where being Marcus Rodriguez was enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before my basic training graduation. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately, the same careful script that had signed report cards and permission slips throughout my childhood. But this letter was different. This one was going to change everything between us. "Marcus," it began, without any of the warmth I remembered from his occasional notes when I was younger. your mother and I have discussed your upcoming graduation ceremony, and we've decided it would be best if we didn't attend. The drive to Fort Benning is quite long, and your father has an important client meeting that week that he cannot reschedule. I read those words 3 times before the meaning sank in. My parents weren't coming to watch me graduate from basic training, the same parents who had driven 8 hours to watch David receive a meaningless award at a college. Ceremony who had never missed a single one of his achievements couldn't be bothered to see their youngest son complete one of the most challenging experiences of his life. The letter continued, each word feeling like a small knife. We understand this is important to you, and we're proud that you've stuck with it. Perhaps when you're finished with all of this military business, you can think about going back to school and doing something more substantial with your life. David has connections at several firms that might be willing to give you a chance. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my footlocker, underneath my dress uniform. Around me, my fellow soldiers were getting ready for evening chow, talking excitedly about their families coming to see them graduate. Peterson's parents were driving from Oregon. William's whole extended family was making the trip from Mississippi. Even Thompson, whose relationship with his father had been rocky for years, was expecting his dad to show up. "Hey, Rodriguez," called out Sergeant Martinez, our drill instructor, who had somehow evolved from terrifying tormentor to something approaching a father figure over the past 12 weeks. "You got your family travel details sorted out. Guest parking fills up fast." On graduation day, I looked up from my bunk, trying to keep my face neutral. "They can't make it, Sergeant. Prior commitments." Martinez studied my face for a long moment. He'd been doing this for 15 years, and I suspected he'd seen this scenario play out before. "That's tough, son, but you know what? You've earned this graduation whether they're here or not. You've become a soldier, and that's something to be proud of." The night before graduation, I called home one last time. My mother answered, her voice bright and cheerful. "Marcus, how are you, sweetie? Are you excited about tomorrow?" "Yeah, Mom, I am." I paused, giving her one last chance. "Are you sure you and Dad can't make it? I know it's a long drive, but, oh honey, I wish we could. But your father really does have this important meeting. You understand, don't you? Besides, David is coming home this weekend with his girlfriend. We're taking them to that new French restaurant downtown. You know how hard it is to get reservations there." There it was. David was coming home, and suddenly my parents had time for elaborate dinner plans, but a 6-hour drive to see their other son graduate from basic training. That was just too much to ask. "I understand, Mom." "Good, I knew you would. You've always been so understanding, Marcus. That's one of your best qualities." After I hung up, I sat in the phone booth for a long time, listening to the sounds of the base at night. Other soldiers were laughing and joking, calling their families, making last-minute arrangements. I thought about calling David, maybe trying to explain what this meant to me, but I knew it was pointless. He'd never understand why I'd chosen this path, and frankly, I wasn't sure I wanted to explain it to him. The next morning, I put on my dress uniform and stood in formation with my fellow graduates. As we marched onto the parade ground, I saw families in the bleachers, parents with cameras, siblings holding signs. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the pride I felt in my own chest. Martinez had been right, I had earned this, whether anyone was there to see it or not. When they called my name and I stepped forward to receive my certificate, I heard a few scattered cheers from the other families. It wasn't the same as having my own people there, but it was something. These strangers were celebrating my achievement simply because I was a fellow soldier, a brother in arms. That night, I called home again. My father answered this time. "Marcus, how did it go?" "Good, Dad. I graduated. I'm officially a soldier now." "That's nice. Son, listen, I've got to run. David and Rebecca are here, and we're heading out to dinner. But congratulations on finishing your training." "Thanks, Dad. Oh, and Marcus, when you get some leave time, come home and visit. Your mother misses you." As I hung up the phone, I realized something had shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, but it was joined by something else, a quiet determination. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had found something here, in the brotherhood of soldiers, in the respect of my drill instructors, in the pride of completing something genuinely difficult. I folded the rejection letter one more time and threw it away. From now on, I would earn my recognition from people who understood the value of what I was doing. My family might never understand, but that was their loss, not mine. The combat boots I laced up that first morning at Forward Operating Base Phoenix would carry me through 3 deployments, countless patrols, and more life-or-death situations than I ever imagined when I first put them on. Those boots became my constant companion, more reliable than family, more faithful than any relationship I'd ever had. Afghanistan hit me like a physical blow. The heat, the dust, the constant awareness that danger could come from anywhere at any time, but more than the environment, it was the responsibility that took my breath away. I wasn't just Marcus Rodriguez anymore, the disappointing younger son who couldn't live up to his brother's achievements. I was Doc Rodriguez, the medic, who held the lives of his squad in his hands. The goodbye at the airport had been exactly what I expected. My parents showed up. Of course it would have looked bad to their friends if they hadn't, but their discomfort was palpable. My father kept checking his watch, my mother kept smoothing down her dress, and both of them seemed eager to get this obligation over with. "Be safe, Marcus," my mother said, giving me a quick hug that felt more like a gesture than genuine affection, "and try to make the best of this experience. Maybe you'll learn some skills that will help you in the civilian world. Maybe you'll even get some college credits out of it," my father added. "The military has programs for that, don't they?" Even as I was leaving for war, they were already planning my exit strategy, already looking ahead to when I'd come home and do something more appropriate with my life. David had come to see me off too, but he spent most of the time on his phone, handling some crisis at work that was apparently more important than his brother's deployment. The flight to Afghanistan was long and surreal. One moment I was in Atlanta, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of home, and the next I was stepping off a transport plane into a world that looked like it belonged on another planet. The mountains rose up around us like ancient sentinels, and the air tasted of dust and diesel fuel and something else, something that took me weeks to identify as the constant presence of danger. My first patrol was 2 days after I arrived. Staff Sergeant Williams, our squad leader, was a career soldier with 2 previous deployments, and the kind of calm competence that made everyone around him feel safer. He pulled me aside before we left the wire. "Rodriguez, I know this is your first time out here, but I want you to understand something. When the shit hits the fan, and it will, these men are going to depend on you. Not because you're the smartest or the strongest, but because you're the one who can keep them alive when they get hurt. You ready for that kind of responsibility?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The truth was, I had no idea if I was ready. All the training in the world couldn't prepare you for the reality of holding someone's life in your hands while bullets flew overhead. The first month was a blur of patrols, checkpoints, and medical calls that ranged from routine to terrifying. I treated everything from heat exhaustion to shrapnel wounds, from anxiety attacks to infections that could turn deadly in the Afghan climate. But more than the medical challenges, it was the relationships that surprised me. These men, from small towns and big cities, from backgrounds as different as you could imagine, became my brothers in ways I'd never experienced. When Private Johnson got word that his wife had left him, the whole squad rallied around him. When Specialist Martinez celebrated his birthday, we pooled our snacks and energy drinks to throw him a party in our tent. When Sergeant Peterson's father died, and he couldn't get home for the funeral, we held our own memorial service right there on the base. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Not because of what I'd accomplished or what degree I had or what job I'd landed, but because of who I was and what I contributed to the group. When someone was hurt, they called for Doc. When someone was scared, they looked to me for reassurance. When someone was dying, I was the one who fought to keep them alive. I called home whenever I could get access to a phone or computer, but the conversations were stilted and strange. My parents would ask generic questions about the food and the weather, carefully avoiding any discussion of what we were actually doing. David would occasionally get on the phone, but he always seemed distracted, eager to get back to his own life. "So what's it like over there?" he asked, during one particularly awkward call. "It's complicated," I said, not sure how to explain. The combination of boredom and terror that defined our daily existence. "We're doing important work, helping people, trying to make things better." "That's good," he said, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. "Just remember, this is temporary. When you get back, you'll want to start thinking about your real career. As if everything I was doing here, the lives I was saving, the skills I was developing, the brotherhood I was building was somehow less real than sitting in an office pushing papers around. After that call, I stopped trying to explain what we were doing. Instead, I focused on the men around me, on the mission, on becoming the best medic I could be. My squad started calling me Doc almost exclusively, and I realized that this nickname meant more to me than any title I'd ever earned. 6 months into my deployment, during a routine patrol in a village outside Kandahar, we came under fire. It was my first real firefight, and the training kicked in before my brain had time to process what was happening. When the shooting stopped, Corporal Davis had taken a round through his leg, and I was the one who kept him from bleeding out while we waited for the medevac helicopter. "Doc, you saved my life," Davis said as they loaded him onto the chopper. "I owe you everything." Standing there in the dust and heat, watching that helicopter disappear into the sky, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. My family might never understand it, but I had found my calling in the most unlikely place imaginable. Those combat boots carried me through 11 more months of deployment, through firefights and medical emergencies, through the loss of friends, and the joy of bringing everyone home safe. By the time I laced them up for the last patrol, they were scuffed and worn, but they had become a part of who I was. I was no longer the kid who couldn't live up to his brother's achievements. I was Doc Rodriguez, and that was enough. The bloodied field dressing I pulled from my aid bag that day in Kandahar is something I'll never forget. Not because of the blood I'd seen, plenty of that by then, but because of what it represented. In those critical minutes, with gunfire echoing off the canyon walls and my commanding officer bleeding out in front of me, that simple piece of medical equipment, became the thin line between life and death for 13 men. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. We'd done the same route dozens of times before, moving through the valley to check on a small village that had been reporting suspicious activity. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had decided to join us personally this time. Something about wanting to get a first-hand look at the situation rather than relying solely on reports. Harrison was the kind of officer who earned respect through competence rather than rank. He'd been in the Army for 15 years, deployed 4 times, and had a reputation for caring more about his soldiers than his own career advancement. When he told us he was coming on patrol, nobody complained. If anything, we felt honored. Ambush came out of nowhere. One moment we were walking through what seemed like empty terrain, and the next moment the world exploded around us. The first RPG hit our lead vehicle, flipping it completely over and trapping 3 men inside. The second RPG landed close enough to knock half our squad to the ground, including Harrison. Ambush left. Ambush left, someone screamed, and training took over. We returned fire, found cover, tried to establish a perimeter, but it was chaos, the kind of controlled chaos that combat becomes when everything goes wrong at once. I was moving toward the overturned vehicle when I saw Harrison go down. He'd been hit in the leg by shrapnel, and blood was pouring out of his femoral artery. In that moment, everything else, the gunfire, the shouting, the explosions, faded into background noise. I had a job to do. I need cover, I yelled, pulling out my aid bag as I low-crawled toward him. Sergeant Williams and 2 other soldiers immediately shifted their fire to give me a corridor of protection. Harrison was conscious, but losing blood fast. The shrapnel had torn through his upper thigh, and I could see immediately that if I didn't get pressure on that wound right now, he was going to bleed out in minutes. I grabbed a field dressing from my bag, the one that would later be stained with his blood, and pressed it hard against the wound. "Stay with me, sir," I said, applying pressure while simultaneously checking him for other injuries. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay conscious." "Rodriguez?" he said through gritted teeth. "The men in the vehicle, I'll get to them, I promised. But first I need to stabilize you." The firefight was intensifying. I could hear Williams calling for air support, could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire from multiple positions. We were outnumbered and pinned down, but I couldn't think about that. I had to focus on the immediate problem in front of me. Got a tourniquet around Harrison's leg, then quickly bandaged the wound with the field dressing. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop completely. He needed surgery, and he needed it soon. But first, I had to get to the overturned vehicle. "Williams," I shouted over the gunfire, "I need to get to the MRAP. Go," he yelled back. "We'll cover you." The run to the vehicle was the longest 30 seconds of my life. Bullets kicked up dirt around my feet, and I could hear the distinctive whistle of more RPGs being fired. I dove behind the overturned vehicle just as an explosion rocked the ground where I'd been standing. Inside the MRAP, 3 soldiers were trapped and injured. Private Morrison had a broken arm and was semi-conscious. Specialist Chen was alert, but had taken shrapnel to his shoulder. Corporal Williams, not related to our squad leader, was the worst off. He was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound, and I couldn't immediately tell how severe his injuries were. I had to work fast. Chen was mobile, so I helped him extract Morrison first. The private was heavier than he looked, and getting him out of the twisted wreckage while under fire was like trying to solve a puzzle while someone shot at you. But we managed it, dragging him to cover behind the vehicle. Williams was harder. He was bigger, unconscious, and wedged in tight. I had to crawl halfway into the vehicle to reach him, all while enemy fire continued to ring off the armor plating. I managed to get another field dressing on his head wound, then slowly worked him free. By the time I got all 3 men out of the vehicle, the firefight had been going on for almost 20 minutes. Air support was inbound, but we needed to hold our position until they arrived. I moved from soldier to soldier, treating wounds, checking vitals, trying to keep everyone stable. Harrison was still conscious, but getting weaker. Morrison had regained consciousness, but was in severe pain. Chen was holding his own but losing blood. Williams was the wild card. Head injuries were unpredictable, and he could crash at any moment. "Doc," Sergeant Williams called out, "we've got 2 more wounded on the south side." I looked around at the men I was already treating, made a quick assessment, and realized I was going to have to make some hard choices. I couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't treat everyone simultaneously. This was triage under fire, kind of situation they'd trained us for but hoped we'd never face. I moved to the south side of our perimeter, where I found 2 more soldiers with gunshot wounds. Neither was immediately life-threatening, but both needed attention. I worked as quickly as I could, bandaging wounds, starting IVs, distributing pain medication. The air support arrived just as I was finishing with the last wounded soldier. The Apache helicopters made short work of the enemy positions, and suddenly the valley was quiet except for the sound of rotors and the moans of injured men. The medevac helicopters arrived 15 minutes later. As I helped load the wounded onto stretchers, Harrison grabbed my arm. "Rodriguez," he said, his voice weak but clear, "you saved my life today. You saved all of us." I looked around at the 13 men who were going home, alive, some wounded, some shaken, but all breathing. The field dressing I'd used on Harrison was completely soaked with blood, but it had done its job. We'd all done our jobs. Just doing what I'm trained for, sir, I said. Harrison smiled weakly. No, son, that was something more than training, that was courage. As the helicopters lifted off, carrying our wounded to safety, I realized that something fundamental had changed. I wasn't just a medic anymore. I wasn't just a soldier. I was someone who had been tested in the crucible of combat and had not been found wanting. The bloodied field dressing went into my gear bag along with the other medical supplies. It wasn't something I planned to keep as a souvenir, it was just part of the job. But later, when I was alone in my tent, I looked at it and realized it represented something important. It was proof that when everything went wrong, when lives hung in the balance, I had been able to rise to the occasion. My family might never understand what happened that day in Kandahar. They might never grasp the weight of responsibility I carried, or the bonds forged in combat. But I knew, and my brothers in arms knew, and that was enough. The field dressing eventually made its way home with me, tucked away in my gear bag. It serves as a reminder not of the violence or the fear, but of the moment when I became exactly who I was meant to be. The commendation letter arrived 6 weeks after the ambush, delivered by a courier who handed it to me with the kind of formal ceremony that made the entire event feel surreal. The paper was thick and official, bearing the seal of the Department of Defense, and the words written on it would have made any soldier proud. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States, it read, Specialist Marcus Rodriguez distinguished himself by exceptionally valorous actions during an enemy ambush in Kandahar province, Afghanistan. Under intense enemy fire, Specialist Rodriguez repeatedly exposed himself to danger to provide life-saving medical treatment to wounded personnel, ultimately saving the lives of 13 soldiers, including his commanding officer. I read it 3 times, alone in my tent, trying to process what it meant. The letter went on to detail the specific actions I'd taken that day, the tourniquet that saved Harrison's life, the extraction of the 3 soldiers from the overturned vehicle, the triage decisions that kept everyone alive until the medevac arrived. It was all there, written in official language that somehow made it sound more heroic than it had felt in the moment. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had recommended me for the Silver Star, the letter explained. The medal would be presented in a ceremony the following month, and my family would be notified of the honor. I was to be commended for bravery above and beyond the call of duty. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my locker, underneath my spare uniforms and personal items. Part of me wanted to call home immediately, to share this moment with my parents, to finally give them something to be proud of. But a bigger part of me hesitated. I'd been disappointed by their reactions too many times before. The ceremony itself was held on the base, with most of our unit in attendance. Harrison had recovered from his wounds and was back on duty, looking healthy and strong as he pinned the Silver Star to my dress uniform. The citation was read aloud, and my fellow soldiers applauded. It was a moment of genuine pride and recognition. This medal represents more than just one day of action, Harrison said to the assembled soldiers. It represents the kind of courage and dedication that defines what it means to be a medic, a soldier, and a man. Specialist Rodriguez didn't just save lives that day, he exemplified the values we all swore to uphold. After the ceremony, I went back to my tent and called home. My mother answered on the 3rd ring, her voice bright and cheerful. Marcus, how wonderful to hear from you. How are things going over there? Good, Mom, really good. I actually have some news to share. I paused, suddenly nervous about how to explain what had happened. I received a medal today, the Silver Star. It's for, oh, that's nice, sweetie, she interrupted. You know, your father and I were just talking about medals. David's company gave him this beautiful crystal award for Employee of the Year. It's sitting right here on the mantle next to his diploma. He's being considered for another promotion. You know, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest. Mom, the Silver Star is it's for saving lives. Under enemy fire, it's one of the highest honors a soldier can receive. I'm sure it is, honey, and we're proud of you for getting it. Oh, I should tell you, David and Rebecca are engaged, can you believe it? They're planning a fall wedding, and Rebecca's father is paying for everything. They're thinking about having it at that beautiful country club downtown. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but I stopped listening after the engagement announcement. My medal recognition for actions that had saved 13 lives was a footnote in a conversation dominated by my brother's personal life. When I hung up, I realized I felt more disappointed than surprised. I didn't tell them about the other recognition that followed. The Army Commendation Medal for my overall service during the deployment, the Combat Medical Badge for providing medical care under fire, the campaign medals and service ribbons that marked my growing experience and competence. Each one represented something significant, something earned through blood and sweat and courage. But I kept them to myself. The letters from home continued to arrive regularly, but they rarely mentioned my service in any meaningful way. My parents would ask generic questions about the weather and the food, then spend paragraphs updating me on David's career progress, his wedding plans, his new house, his promotion to senior vice president. They meant well, I think. But their priorities were clear. On my first leave back home, 9 months after the ambush, I decided to test the waters. I brought my dress uniform with me, with all the medals and ribbons properly displayed. I thought maybe if they could see the physical proof of what I'd accomplished, they might understand. The visit was exactly what I'd expected. My parents were polite but distant, asking surface-level questions about my military experience, while clearly hoping I'd announce plans to get out and do something more conventional with my life. David was there with Rebecca, and the conversation inevitably turned to their upcoming wedding, his latest promotion, their plans to buy a bigger house. "So when are you thinking about getting out?" my father asked over dinner. "You've got to be eligible for some kind of educational benefits by now. Maybe you could go back to school, get a degree in something practical. David knows people who might be able to help you get started." I looked down at my dress uniform, at the silver star on my chest, at the combat medical badge that marked me as someone who had saved lives under the worst possible circumstances. To my family, it was all just a phase, something I needed to get through before I could start my real life. "I'm thinking about making this my career," I said quietly. "I'm good at what I do. I'm helping people. I'm making a difference." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. My mother reached over and patted my hand. "That's sweet, Marcus, but you have to think about your future. The military is fine for young men who don't have other options, but you're smart enough to do something more significant with your life." Something more significant. I thought about Harrison, alive because of my actions. I thought about the 3 soldiers I'd pulled from that overturned vehicle, all of whom had gone home to their families. I thought about the dozens of other soldiers I'd treated over the course of my deployment. Men who were walking around healthy because I'd been there when they needed me, but none of that mattered to my family. None of that counted as significant. I put the commendation letter away when I got back to base, filed it with the other official documents that marked my service. I stopped trying to share my achievements with my parents, stopped hoping they'd understand what I was doing or why it mattered. Instead, I focused on the respect I earned from my fellow soldiers, the pride I felt in my work, the knowledge that I was making a real difference in the world. The silver star sits in my now, along with the other medals and ribbons I've earned. They're not displayed on any mantle, not featured in any family photos, not mentioned in any proud phone calls to relatives. But they're mine, earned through actions that saved lives and protected the men I served with. Sometimes, recognition comes from the people you expect it from. Sometimes it comes from strangers who understand the value of what you've done. And sometimes, the most important recognition comes from looking in the mirror and knowing you've lived up to the values you swore to uphold. The commendation letter may be filed away, but the pride it represents lives on in everything I do. My family may never understand, but I know who I am and what I've accomplished. And for now, that's enough. The corporate bonus check arrived at my parents' house on a Tuesday in March. While I was preparing for my second deployment, I wouldn't learn about it until months later, when my mother mentioned it casually during one of our phone calls. But that piece of paper, 6 figures written in neat corporate script, would become the centerpiece of a celebration I was never invited to join. "David got his year-end bonus," my mother said, her voice practically vibrating with excitement. "Marcus, you won't believe how much it was. More than most people make in 2 years. And that's on top of his regular salary. Mind you, he's doing so well at the firm." I was sitting in my tent at Forward Operating Base Shank, cleaning my rifle, and trying to decompress after a particularly difficult patrol. The conversation felt like it was happening in another world. My mother's breathless excitement about my brother's financial success contrasted sharply with the dusty reality of Afghanistan. "That's great, Mom," I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I wanted David to succeed. I wanted him to be happy. But I also couldn't help wondering why this news warranted a 20-minute phone call when my recent promotion to sergeant had earned a 30-second acknowledgement. "Oh, but that's not even the best part," she continued. "They're promoting him to senior vice president. Can you imagine? Your brother, a senior vice president at 31 years old? Your father is beside himself with pride. We're throwing him a party this weekend. The whole family is coming, plus all his friends from college and some of his colleagues from work. It's going to be wonderful." I listened to her describe the party plans in exhaustive detail. The catered dinner from David's favorite restaurant, the custom cake with his company logo, the champagne toast where my father would give a speech about his son's remarkable achievements, the photographer they'd hired to capture every moment of this milestone celebration. "We wanted to make sure we documented everything properly," she explained. "This is such an important moment in David's life. We'll have professional photos to commemorate his success." As she talked, I found myself thinking about my own recent achievements that had gone largely unnoticed by my family. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been recognized by my commanding officer for developing a new trauma protocol that had already saved 2 lives. A month before that, I'd completed advanced medical training that qualified me to handle complex battlefield surgeries. None of these accomplishments had warranted a party, a photographer, or even a congratulatory phone call. I wish you could be here for it, my mother said, though her tone suggested this was more polite sentiment than genuine disappointment. But I know you're busy with your military things. My military things. 3 tours of duty, countless lives saved. Leadership responsibilities that most people twice my age would struggle with, all reduced to military things. Yeah, I said quietly. I'm pretty busy out here. After I hung up, I sat in my tent, staring at the phone for a long time. Around me, other soldiers were writing letters home, video chatting with their families, sharing pictures of their kids and spouses. The contrast was stark. Their families celebrated every small victory, every safe return from patrol, every promotion or recognition. My family celebrated corporate bonuses. The party happened exactly as my mother described. I know, because she posted dozens of photos on social media, something she'd started doing more frequently as David's career took off. There was David in his expensive suit, grinning as he held up a crystal plaque from his company. There were my parents, beaming with pride as they flanked their successful son. There was the custom cake, the champagne toast, the professional photographer capturing every moment. In the comments section, friends and relatives heaped praise on my parents for raising such a successful young man. You must be so proud, they wrote. What an accomplishment. He's going places. My mother responded to each comment with detailed explanations of David's achievements, his responsibilities, his bright future. I scrolled through the photos twice, looking for any mention of my own recent promotion or achievements. There was nothing, not a single reference to their other son who was serving his country halfway around the world. It was as if I didn't exist. The bonus check itself became a family legend. My mother framed a copy of it, not the actual check, but a photocopy, and hung it in the hallway next to David's diplomas and awards. She would show it to visitors, explaining how her son had earned such a substantial bonus through his hard work and dedication. 6 figures, she would say, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a delicious secret. Can you imagine? And he's only 31. The sky's the limit for that boy. Meanwhile, my military pay, modest by civilian standards, but earned through genuine danger and sacrifice, was never mentioned. My combat pay, my hazard duty pay, my family separation allowance, none of it registered as noteworthy to my parents. Money earned by sitting in an air-conditioned office was impressive. Money earned by dodging bullets in Afghanistan was just part of the job. The celebration continued for weeks. David used part of his bonus to buy a new BMW, which prompted another round of family excitement and social media posts. He and Rebecca upgraded to a larger apartment in an expensive part of town, which my mother toured extensively and documented with photos. He bought expensive gifts for the family, a new watch for my father, jewelry for my mother, designer accessories for Rebecca. Your brother is so generous, my mother told me during our next call. He took us all out to dinner at that new steakhouse downtown, the one where entrees start at $50. Can you imagine? He didn't even blink at the bill. I could imagine it. Actually, I could imagine David enjoying the role of family benefactor, basking in the gratitude and admiration of parents who had always favored him. I could imagine my parents' pride in their successful son, their satisfaction in being able to brag about his accomplishments to their friends. What I couldn't imagine was how they'd managed to completely overlook their other son's achievements. In the months leading up to David's bonus celebration, I'd been decorated for valor, promoted for leadership, and recognized by my commanding officers for exceptional performance. I'd saved lives, lead soldiers through dangerous situations, and proven myself under the worst possible circumstances. But none of that mattered as much as a corporate bonus check. The most painful part wasn't the money itself. I'd never cared much about financial success. It was what the celebration represented. My family's values, their definition of success, their vision of what made a life worthwhile. In their world, David's bonus was an achievement worth commemorating. My service to my country was just something I did until I could find a real career. I stopped looking at my mother's social media posts after that. I stopped asking about family gatherings and celebrations. When my parents called, I listened politely to their updates about David's continued success, but I stopped sharing my own achievements. There was no point in trying to compete with 6-figure bonuses and corporate promotions. Instead, I focused on the recognition that mattered, the respect of my fellow soldiers, the trust of my commanding officers, the knowledge that I was making a real difference in the world. My squad looked up to me, counted on me, valued my contributions in ways my family never had. The bonus check may have been worth more than most people make in 2 years, but it couldn't buy the kind of purpose and meaning I'd found in my service. David's success was measured in dollars and titles. Mine was measured in lives saved and battles won. As I prepared for my second deployment, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in my relationship with my family. I still loved them, still wanted their approval on some level, but I no longer needed it. I'd found my own definition of success, my own measure of worth, my own source of pride. The corporate bonus check sits in a frame in my parents' house, a testament to achievement they understand and value. My silver star sits in my footlocker, a testament to achievement they may never comprehend. Both represent success, but only one represents the kind of man I want to be. The welcome home. Banners stretched across the entrance to Forward Operating Base Phoenix, hand-painted by the soldiers of Charlie Company in red, white and blue letters that had been touched up 3 times as different groups of us rotated home. It wasn't much to look at, rough canvas and spray paint, but it meant more to me than any formal ceremony could have. My 3rd deployment was ending, and unlike the previous 2 homecomings, this one felt different. Not because of anything my family had done. Their enthusiasm for my return remained characteristically muted, but because of what I'd accomplished. 3 tours of duty, dozens of lives saved, the respect of my peers and superiors, and a service record that spoke for itself. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, now a full colonel after his own promotion, was rotating home on the same flight. We'd served together through 2 deployments since the ambush that had first brought us together, and he'd become something of a mentor to me. As we prepared to board the transport back to the States, he pulled me aside. "Rodriguez, I've got something to tell you. When we get back, I want you to meet my family. My wife's been wanting to thank you personally ever since Kandahar, and my kids want to meet the man who saved their dad's life." I was honored but also slightly puzzled. "Sir, you don't need to actually." "I do," he interrupted, "and there's something else. Your family is planning some kind of welcome home gathering, right?" I nodded reluctantly. My mother had mentioned something about a small get-together, though her enthusiasm had been notably less than when she'd planned David's promotion party. "Yeah, something small." "Good, because I want to be there. I want to meet the people who raised the man who saved my life and the lives of 12 other soldiers. I want to tell them what kind of son they have." The flight home was long and uneventful, giving me time to think about what awaited me. I'd been gone for 15 months this time, and the communications from home had followed their usual pattern: polite interest in my safety, minimal engagement with my actual work, and extensive updates about David's continued corporate success. He'd made partner at his firm, bought a house, and gotten married in a ceremony that had dominated family conversation for months. When we landed at Fort Benning, I was surprised to see Colonel Harrison waiting for me at baggage claim. He'd changed into his dress uniform, complete with all his ribbons and decorations. "Ready to meet the family?" he asked with a grin. The drive to my parents' house was awkward. I kept trying to explain the family dynamics, to prepare Harrison for what he was about to encounter. But how do you tell a superior officer that your parents are likely to be more interested in discussing your brother's latest business deal than your military service? "Sir, I should probably warn you, my family doesn't really understand the military. They're good people, but they have different priorities." Harrison looked at me with the same expression he'd worn during some of our more challenging briefings. "Rodriguez, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've met all kinds of families. Don't worry about it." My parents' house looked exactly the same as always: well-maintained suburban comfort with David's achievements prominently displayed in every room. My mother answered the door with the kind of smile she reserved for company, and I could see her taking in Harrison's uniform and rank insignia with obvious confusion. "Marcus, you're home." She hugged me briefly, then turned to Harrison. "And you must be one of Marcus's friends from the military." "Ma'am, I'm Colonel Harrison, Marcus's commanding officer. I asked if I could join your celebration today, because I have some things I'd like to share with you about your son." My father appeared in the doorway, and I watched him process Harrison's rank and bearing, whatever he'd expected from my military colleagues. It clearly wasn't this confident, decorated officer who carried himself with unmistakable authority. "Colonel, my goodness, please, come in. We're honored to have you in our home." The gathering was small: my parents, David and his wife Rebecca, a few family friends, and now Harrison. The atmosphere was polite but restrained, exactly what I'd expected. People asked generic questions about my deployment, thanked me for my service in the abstract way civilians do, and generally seemed uncomfortable with the reality of what I'd been doing for the past 15 months. David, to his credit, seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my experiences. He'd always been competitive with me, but he'd never been actively dismissive of my choices the way our parents were. "So Marcus, this was your 3rd deployment?" he asked over dinner. "That's got to be pretty intense." "It has its moments," I said, not wanting to get into details that would make people uncomfortable. That's when Harrison cleared his throat and stood up. "Actually, if I may, I'd like to say a few words about Marcus's service." The room fell silent. Harrison had the kind of presence that commanded attention, and everyone instinctively turned toward him. "I've been in the Army for 20 years, he began, his voice carrying the authority of command. "I've served with hundreds of soldiers, from privates fresh out of basic training to generals with decades of experience. In all that time, I've rarely encountered a soldier who combines technical expertise, leadership ability, and raw courage the way your son does." I felt my face flush. This wasn't what I'd expected when Harrison asked to come. 3 years ago, in a valley outside Kandahar, Marcus saved my life. But that's not the whole story. Under intense enemy fire, with RPGs exploding around us, and automatic weapons fire coming from multiple directions, he didn't just save me, he saved 12 other soldiers that day. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. My father leaned forward, suddenly paying attention in a way I'd rarely seen. continued, his voice steady and clear. Marcus pulled 3 soldiers out of an overturned vehicle while under fire. He performed battlefield surgery on a soldier with a severed artery. He triaged multiple casualties while managing his own safety and maintaining communication with our support elements. He did all of this while being shot at by an enemy that was trying very hard to kill all of us. The room was completely silent now. Rebecca had her hand over her mouth. David was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. But here's what really sets Marcus apart, Harrison said, looking directly at my parents. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over 3 deployments, he's saved dozens of lives, earned the respect of every soldier he's served with, and demonstrated the kind of leadership and character that the Army hopes to find in its best soldiers. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. These are copies of Marcus's commendations and awards. Silver Star for gallantry and action. Bronze Star with V device for valor. Army Commendation Medal with V device. Combat Medical Badge. He's been recommended for promotion to Staff Sergeant, and his efficiency reports rank him in the top 1% of soldiers in his military occupational specialty. My mother was crying now, though I wasn't sure if it was from pride or shock or some combination of both. My father looked like he was trying to process information that didn't fit with his understanding of who I was. Harrison handed the folder to my parents and sat back down. I wanted you to know, he said quietly, that the man you raised isn't just a good soldier. He's an exceptional human being who has dedicated his life to protecting others. You should be very proud. The banner hanging across the base entrance had welcomed me home, but it was Harrison's words in my parents' living room that truly marked my return. For the first time in my adult life, my family was seeing me not as the disappointing younger son who couldn't live up to his brother's achievements, but as someone who had achieved something extraordinary in his own right. The gathering continued for another hour, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. People asked different questions, listened more carefully to my answers, looked at me with something approaching respect. It wasn't the celebration I'd dreamed of as a child, but it was something better. It was recognition based on truth rather than expectation. As Harrison prepared to leave, he shook my parents' hands and smiled. Thank you for raising such a fine soldier. The Army is lucky to have him. After he left, my family sat in awkward silence for several minutes. Finally, my father spoke. Marcus, why didn't you ever tell us about any of this? I looked around the room at the framed photos of David's achievements, at the corporate awards and diplomas that had dominated family conversation for years, at the parents who had spent decades dismissing my choices as a phase I'd grow out of. I tried, I said simply, but I don't think you were ready to hear it. The banner from the base entrance now hangs in my apartment, a reminder that sometimes the recognition that matters most comes from the people who understand the value of what you've done. But that day in my parents' living room, watching them finally see me for who I'd become, was the homecoming I'd been waiting for my entire life. The citation for valor lay spread across my parents' coffee table like evidence in a trial. Each line of official text rewriting everything they thought they knew about their younger son. Colonel Harrison had left it behind along with the other documents, and now my family stared at the formal language that described actions they were struggling to comprehend. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, my mother read aloud, her voice shaking slightly. While serving as a combat medic during a coordinated enemy attack on his unit's patrol in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, Sergeant Rodriguez repeatedly exposed himself to intense enemy fire to provide life-saving medical treatment to wounded soldiers. She stopped reading and looked up at me. Marcus, this says you were under enemy fire. People were shooting at you while you were trying to help wounded soldiers. I nodded, suddenly feeling uncomfortable under their scrutiny. For years, I'd wanted their attention, their recognition, their pride. Now that I had it, I wasn't sure how to handle it. The enemy initiated the attack with rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons fire from multiple concealed positions. David Reed, picking up where my mother had left off. Despite the extreme danger, Sergeant Rodriguez immediately moved to assist his wounded commanding officer, applying a tourniquet and field dressing under direct fire. My father leaned forward, his business-trained mind apparently trying to process the logistics of what was being described. You applied a tourniquet under fire. Marcus, do you understand what that means? You saved someone's life while people were trying to kill you. The way he said it made it sound impossible, like something from a movie rather than something his son had actually done. And maybe that was part of the problem. My family had never been able to imagine me in situations that required real courage, real skill, real leadership. It's what medics do. Dad, I said quietly. It's what I was trained for. No, Harrison's voice came from the doorway. I turned to see him standing there, having apparently returned after forgetting something in his car. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. With all due respect, Marcus, what you did that day went far beyond training. He entered the room and sat back down, his expression serious. I've been in combat zones for 15 years. I've seen medics work under fire, and I've seen soldiers demonstrate courage in impossible situations. What Marcus did was extraordinary, even by military standards. Harrison looked directly at my parents. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because I want you to understand what kind of man your son is. He described the ambush in detail. The sudden explosion of violence, the chaos of soldiers scrambling for cover, the immediate recognition that multiple men were down and bleeding. He talked about the sound of bullets hitting the ground around us, the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning metal, the way time seemed to slow down when everything went wrong at once. I was hit in the leg by shrapnel from the first RPG, Harrison continued. The pain was incredible, and I could see blood pooling underneath me. I knew I was in trouble. That's when Marcus appeared. My mother gripped my father's hand as Harrison described how I'd crawled toward him under fire, how I'd applied pressure to his wound while bullets kicked up dirt around us, how I'd calmly talked him through what I was doing while explosions rocked the ground nearby. But he didn't stop there, Harrison said. After he stabilized me, he literally ran under fire to an overturned vehicle where 3 more soldiers were trapped. The enemy was still shooting at us. RPGs were still being fired. Marcus could have stayed in cover and waited for the situation to calm down. Instead, he exposed himself to danger repeatedly to save the lives of men who were counting on him. Rebecca was crying now, and David looked like he was seeing me for the first time. My parents sat in stunned silence as Harrison continued his account. He pulled 3 unconscious soldiers out of that vehicle one by one. Each extraction meant exposing himself to enemy fire. Each rescue meant making a choice to put someone else's life ahead of his own safety. And he did it without hesitation, without complaint, without thinking about the danger to himself. Harrison picked up the citation and pointed to a specific paragraph. This part here repeatedly exposed himself to danger. That's military speak for saying Marcus was willing to die to save his fellow soldiers. And he did it not once, but over and over again throughout that firefight. My father was reading over Harrison's shoulder, his face pale. It says here he treated 13 wounded soldiers. 13. That's right, Harrison confirmed. After he got the men out of the vehicle, he moved through our defensive perimeter, treating wounded soldiers while the battle was still going on. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, traumatic amputations, he handled it all, while enemy fighters were actively trying to kill him. The room fell silent except for the soft sound of my mother crying. I sat there feeling exposed and uncomfortable, not sure how to respond to this level of attention and scrutiny from my family. There's something else you should know, Harrison, said his voice softer now. Marcus has never talked about any of this, has he? Never bragged about his medals? Never described his combat experiences? Never tried to explain what he's been through? My parents shook their heads. That's because he's a professional. Real soldiers, real heroes, don't talk about this stuff casually. They don't use their service as a way to impress people or gain attention. They do their job, they take care of their brothers, and they come home and try to build normal lives. Harrison looked at me with something approaching paternal pride. But you deserve to know that your son is respected throughout the army. His reputation as a medic is known at levels far above my rank. Other soldiers ask to serve with him because they know he'll bring them home alive. Commanders fight to have him assigned to their units because they know he makes everyone around him better. David cleared his throat. Marcus, I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were deployed, and I knew it was dangerous, but I never really understood what that meant. I looked at my brother's successful, confident David, who had never doubted his place in the family, and saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine respect. The thing is, I said, finding my voice, I tried to tell you, all of you, not the details, because that's not appropriate. But I tried to explain that what we were doing mattered, that it was important, that it was something to be proud of. My mother wiped her eyes. We were proud, Marcus. We didn't understand. You didn't want to understand, I said, not harshly, but truthfully. You wanted me to come home and get a normal job and be more like David. You wanted me to apologize for choosing the military instead of college, for choosing service over success as you defined it. The citation lay between us like a bridge across years of misunderstanding. Here was proof, in official language backed by the full authority of the United States Army, that their younger son had accomplished something extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the way of corporate bonuses or academic achievements, but extraordinary in the most fundamental way possible. He had risked his life to save others. Harrison stood up, recognizing that this conversation needed to happen within the family. I'll leave you all to talk, but before I go, I want to say one more thing. He looked directly at my parents. Your son is a hero in the truest sense of the word, not because of what happened in one firefight, but because of who he chooses to be every single day. The Army has taught me to recognize courage, and Marcus has it in abundance. You're lucky to be his family. After Harrison left, we sat in silence for a long time. The citation remained spread across the coffee table, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Finally, my father spoke. Marcus, I owe you an apology. We all do. We've been so focused on one definition of success that we couldn't see what you were actually achieving. I nodded, not sure what to say. The recognition felt good, but it also felt fragile, like something that could be taken away if I said the wrong thing. I want to understand, my mother said. I want to know what your life has been like, what you've been through, what it means to do what you do. For the first time in years, I felt like my family was ready to see me as I actually was rather than as they wanted me to be. The citation had opened a door that years of explanation couldn't budge. Sometimes it takes official documentation to make people believe what they should have been able to see all along. The paper would eventually be framed and hung in my parents' house, next to David's achievements, but occupying its own space of honor. But more important than the physical recognition was what it represented. The moment my family finally understood that their younger son had found his calling and excelled at it, in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The newspaper article was dated 6 months earlier, yellowed slightly from being tucked away in Colonel Harrison's personal files. He'd pulled it out during that revelatory evening at my parents' house, adding it to the growing pile of evidence that my family had somehow missed my entire military career. Local hero returns from Afghanistan. Read the headline in the Metro section of our hometown paper. Below it was a photo I didn't remember posing for me in my dress uniform, standing in front of an American flag, looking serious and professional, in a way that seemed at odds with how my family saw me. My mother picked up the article with trembling hands. "When was this published?" "Last March," Harrison replied, right after Marcus's second deployment ended. The reporter interviewed several members of his unit, his commanding officers, even some of the soldiers whose lives he saved. I watched. My parents read the article, their faces cycling through expressions of shock, pride, and something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. The piece was thorough, detailing not just the Kandahar incident but my entire service record, my reputation within the Army, and the respect I'd earned from colleagues and superiors. "Sergeant Rodriguez is the kind of medic every soldier wants on their team," my father read aloud. "His technical skills are matched only by his courage under fire and his dedication to bringing everyone home alive." The article included quotes from soldiers I'd served with, men whose names my family had never heard because I'd stopped talking about my military life. Private Chen, whom I'd pulled from the overturned vehicle, described how I'd stayed with him during the helicopter evacuation, keeping him conscious and calm. Staff Sergeant Williams talked about my leadership during firefights, how younger soldiers looked to me for guidance and reassurance. "He's saved more lives than most doctors," Williams was quoted as saying, "and he's done it under conditions that would break most people. Rodriguez isn't just a medic, he's a lifeline." But it was the quote from Colonel Harrison that made my mother start crying again. Sergeant Rodriguez represents the best of what military service can be. He's a man who has repeatedly chosen to put others before himself, often at great personal risk. His parents should be incredibly proud of the son they raised. My father looked up from the article. "Marcus, how did we not know about this? How did we miss a newspaper article about our own son?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable in its implications. How had they missed it? Because they weren't looking. Because they'd never thought to Google my name or check local news for stories about area soldiers. Because they'd been so focused on David's corporate achievements that they'd stopped paying attention to anything that didn't fit their definition of success. "There have been other articles," Harrison said gently. "This isn't the only recognition Marcus has received. The VFW gave him their Outstanding Service Award last year. The mayor proclaimed a Sergeant Rodriguez Day after his first deployment. There was a feature in the Army Times about innovative battlefield medical techniques that mentioned his work. Each revelation was like another small blow to my parents' understanding of their own family dynamics. They'd been living in a parallel universe where their younger son was an underachiever, who'd chosen the military as a fallback option, while the actual world had been recognizing me as someone exceptional. David had been quiet throughout most of this discussion, but now he spoke up. "I remember this article," he said slowly. "I saw it online and saved it to show Mom and Dad. But then I got distracted with work stuff and forgot about it." The admission created an awkward silence. David had seen recognition of my achievements, and had simply forgotten to share it with our parents. It wasn't malicious, but it spoke to the family dynamics that had marginalized my service for years. "There's something else," Harrison continued, pulling out his phone. "Marcus probably doesn't know about this because he's too modest to look himself up, but there are online forums where soldiers discuss combat medics they've served with. His reputation extends far beyond his immediate unit. He showed us a military discussion board where my name had come up in a thread about exceptional medics. Soldiers from different units, different deployments, even different branches of the military, had shared stories about working with me or hearing about my work secondhand. Doc Rodriguez saved my battle buddy's life in Helmand Province. One post read took shrapnel himself, but kept working until everyone was stable. Best medic I ever served with. Another post described how I'd developed an improvised treatment protocol that had been adopted by other medics throughout our area of operations. A third mentioned my reputation for volunteering for the most dangerous patrols, because that's where soldiers were most likely to need medical support. "This is what your son is known for in the military community," Harrison explained. "Not just competence, but extraordinary dedication. Soldiers request him specifically because they trust him with their lives." My mother set down the newspaper article and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and regret. Marcus, I feel like I don't even know you. All these years I thought you were just marking time until you figured out what you really wanted to do with your life. This is what I really want to do with my life, I said quietly. This is what I'm good at. This is where I belong. My father nodded slowly. I can see that now. But Marcus, why didn't you fight harder to make us understand? Why didn't you show us these articles, these awards, these testimonials? It was a fair question, and one I'd asked myself many times over the years. Because I shouldn't have had to, I said finally. You're my family. You should have been interested enough to find out what I was actually doing instead of assuming it wasn't important. The truth was uncomfortable but necessary. For years I'd tried to share my experiences, my achievements, my pride in my work, but every attempt had been met with polite disinterest or gentle redirection toward more practical career options. Eventually, I'd stopped trying to compete for attention with David's corporate success, and had found validation elsewhere. Rebecca, who had been mostly silent throughout the evening, finally spoke up. When David and I got engaged, you called to congratulate us from Afghanistan. Remember? You were between patrols or something, and the connection was terrible. I thought about asking you what it was really like over there, but David said you probably couldn't talk about it. I could have talked about some of it, I said. I wanted to, but every time I tried to explain what my life was like, what my work meant to me, the conversation would shift to something else. Wedding plans, David's promotion, family gossip. It became easier to just ask about home and let you do the talking. Harrison gathered up the articles and documents, creating a neat pile of evidence that painted a picture of a man my family was only now beginning to understand. I've seen this before, he said. Military families often struggle to bridge the gap between civilian life and military service, but in this case, I think the problem went deeper than that. He looked directly at my parents. Marcus stopped trying to share his achievements with you because he learned that you weren't interested in the kind of success he was achieving. You had a definition of accomplishment that didn't include military service. And rather than expanding that definition, you waited for him to conform to it. The newspaper article now sits framed in my parents' den, next to other family photos and achievements. But the real impact wasn't the physical recognition, it was the realization that they'd missed years of my life because they'd never bothered to look beyond their own expectations. That evening marked the beginning of a different kind of relationship with my family. Not perfect, and not without its awkward moments, but honest in a way it had never been before. They started asking different questions during our phone calls. Reading the articles I sent them, trying to understand the world I'd chosen to inhabit. The uncomfortable truth was that they'd spent years dismissing my achievements, not because they weren't impressive, but because they didn't fit the narrative my family had constructed about success. The newspaper article and online testimonials forced them to confront the possibility that their younger son had found his calling and excelled at it in ways they'd never bothered to discover. Recognition from strangers had finally opened their eyes to what should have been obvious all along, that courage and dedication come in many forms, and that sometimes the most meaningful achievements are the ones that save lives rather than earn bonuses. The article would be the first of many. They'd start collecting, as they began paying attention to the son they'd overlooked for far too long. The family photo had been hanging in the hallway for 2 years, and I'd seen it every time I came home on leave. But it wasn't until that evening with Colonel Harrison's revelations, still fresh in the air, that its significance truly hit me. There we were, Mom, Dad, David and Rebecca, all dressed in Christmas sweaters and smiling at the camera. For people, a complete family, according to the photographer who'd captured the moment. Except I was supposed to be the 5th person in that photo. I was supposed to be there for Christmas 2019, but I'd been deployed to Afghanistan, spending the holiday treating soldiers with everything from homesickness to shrapnel wounds. While my family was posing for their perfect holiday photo, I was 7,000 miles away, serving my country and thinking about the family gathering I was missing. After Colonel Harrison left and the initial shock of his revelations began to wear off, my family settled into an uncomfortable silence. The living room felt different now, charged with the weight of 3 years' worth of unspoken truths. Finally, I stood up and walked to the hallway, looking at that damn photo. You know what bothers me most about this? I said, my voice carrying back to the living room where my family still sat. Surrounded by the evidence of my achievements they'd ignored, my parents and David joined me in the hallway, following my gaze to the Christmas photo. It's not that I missed Christmas, I continued. I understood that deployment meant missing holidays. That's part of the job. What bothers me is that you didn't miss me. You took this photo, had it professionally printed and framed, and hung it in your house as if this was your complete family. My mother started to speak, but I held up my hand. No, let me finish. I've been holding this back for years, and tonight seems like the right time to get it all out. I turned away from the photo to face them directly. For my entire adult life, you've treated my military service like a phase I was going through, like something embarrassing you had to tolerate until I came to my senses and chose a real career. You've dismissed my achievements, ignored my awards, and made it clear that nothing I accomplished in the Army could possibly measure up to David's corporate success. My father opened his mouth to protest, but I continued. Dad, When I called to tell you I'd been promoted to staff sergeant, you spent 30 seconds congratulating me and then 20 minutes talking about David's bonus. When I was awarded the Bronze Star, you asked if it would help me get a job when I got out. When I told you I was thinking about making the Army my career, you literally said I was too smart to waste my life in the military. The words were spilling out now, 3 years of accumulated hurt and frustration finally finding voice. Mom, you've introduced me to your friends as Marcus, our son, who's in the military, in the same tone you'd use to say Marcus, our son who's having some trouble, like it was something to be pitied rather than respected. My mother's face was pale, but I wasn't done. Do you have any idea what it's like to come home from a deployment where you've saved lives, where you've been recognized for valor, where you've led soldiers through combat, only to have your own family treat you like you're wasting your potential? David stepped forward. Marcus, we never meant to make you feel that way, didn't you? I turned to face my brother directly. David, you've been successful, and I'm genuinely proud of you for that. But success isn't just measured in salary figures and corporate titles. Tonight, Colonel Harrison told you that I've saved dozens of lives, that soldiers request me specifically because they trust me with their lives, that I'm known throughout the Army for my dedication and skill. Doesn't that count as success too? David looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Of course it does. It's just not the kind of success that fits on a resume. It's just not the kind of achievement you can brag about at cocktail parties. It's just not something that looks good on Christmas cards. I gestured back toward the photo. This picture says everything about how this family works. When I'm not here, I'm not missed. When I'm here, I'm tolerated. My accomplishments are footnotes to David's achievements. My service is something to be endured until I grow out of it. My mother was crying again, but this time it felt different. These weren't tears of pride or shock. These were tears of recognition, of understanding that they'd hurt me in ways they were only now beginning to comprehend. Marcus, she said softly, we love you. We've always loved you. I know you love me, I replied. But love isn't enough if it doesn't include respect. And you've never respected my choices, my career, or my achievements. You've been waiting for me to become someone else instead of appreciating who I actually am. My father, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. You're right. We were wrong. I was wrong. I let my own ideas about success blind me to what you were actually accomplishing. I looked at him, seeing something in his face I'd rarely witnessed: genuine humility. Dad, when I was growing up you taught me that character mattered more than money, that helping people was more important than helping yourself, that service to others was the highest calling. But when I chose a career built on those principles, you acted like I'd disappointed you. Because I was scared, he admitted. I was scared you'd get hurt. Scared you wouldn't have the financial security I wanted for you. Scared you'd chosen a path that would be harder than it needed to be. And instead of trusting that you'd raised me well enough to make good decisions, you decided my choices were wrong. The hallway felt too small for this conversation, so we moved back to the living room, where the certificates and articles Colonel Harrison had left behind still covered the coffee table. The physical evidence of my achievements created a strange backdrop for this long-overdue discussion. I stopped trying to share my life with you because it became too painful, I said, settling into a chair across from them. Every phone call, every visit home, every attempt to explain what I was doing, or why it mattered, it all felt like I was defending myself to a jury that had already decided I was guilty of poor judgment. Rebecca, who had been mostly silent throughout the evening, spoke up. Marcus, I'm sorry. I think we all just assumed David always talked about your service in a way that made it sound temporary, like something you were doing until you figured out your next step. I looked at David. Is that really how you talked about my career? Like it was just marking time? David had the grace to look ashamed. I guess I did. I never thought about how that sounded or what it implied. I couldn't understand why you'd choose something so dangerous when you had other options. Because it's what I'm good at, I said simply. Because it's where I'm needed. Because it's work that matters in the most fundamental way possible. I'm not just making money or climbing a corporate ladder, I'm saving lives. I'm protecting people. I'm serving something bigger than myself. The room fell quiet again, as my family processed what I'd said. The Christmas photo still hung in the hallway, a permanent reminder of how they'd defined their family in my absence. But something had shifted in this conversation, some fundamental understanding that couldn't be taken back. What do you need from us? My mother asked finally. How do we fix this? I considered the question carefully. I need you to see my military service as a career, not a phase. I need you to be proud of what I've accomplished, not sorry that I haven't accomplished something else. I need you to respect my choices, even if they're different from what you would have chosen for me. My father nodded slowly. We can do that. We should have been doing that all along. And I need you to understand that I might stay in the Army for 20 years or more. This isn't something I'm going to grow out of or move on from. This is my life, and I'm good at it. David leaned forward. Marcus, I want to understand better. Would you be willing to tell me more about what you actually do? Not just the dangerous parts, but the day-to-day stuff, the training, the leadership responsibilities. For the first time in years, I felt like my brother was genuinely interested in my life rather than just being polite. I'd like that. The confrontation wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. Years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding don't disappear in a single conversation, but they can begin to heal when people are finally willing to face the truth about their relationships. The Christmas photo still hangs in the hallway, but now it's joined by other photos of me in uniform. Images from military ceremonies, pictures of me with my fellow soldiers. My family is learning to expand their definition of both success and family, and I'm learning to believe that their love might finally include respect. The conversation that night didn't fix everything, but it opened a door that had been closed for too long. And sometimes, that's all you need, a willingness to walk through that door and see what's on the other side. The therapy session notes were folded neatly in David's wallet. Worn from being handled during moments of anxiety and self-doubt, I discovered them by accident 2 weeks after our family confrontation, when David asked me to grab his wallet from his jacket while he was helping Rebecca with something in the kitchen. A corner of paper was sticking out, and when I went to push it back in, I saw my own name written in what looked like a therapist's handwriting. Session number 12. David continues to process feelings of inadequacy related to brother's military service. The visible portion read, reports increased anxiety following recent family gathering where brother's achievements were highlighted. I stared at that piece of paper for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. David was in therapy, and apparently at least part of his sessions involved talking about me. When David returned to the living room, I was still holding his wallet, the paper partially visible. He saw what I was looking at, and his face went pale. Marcus, I can explain. You don't have to explain anything, I said, handing him the wallet. But if you want to talk about it, I'm listening. David sat down heavily in the chair across from me, the wallet clutched in his hands like a lifeline. For a moment, he looked like the uncertain younger brother I remembered from childhood. Before, he'd become the golden child who could do no wrong. I've been seeing Dr. Martinez for about 6 months, he said finally, since around the time I made partner at the firm. I waited, not sure what to say. This was the last thing I'd expected from my supremely confident brother. You'd think making partner would have been this great triumph, right? Everything I'd worked for, everything Mom and Dad had hoped for, and it was, for about a week. Then I started having panic attacks. David pulled the notes out of his wallet and unfolded them, revealing several pages of handwritten observations and insights. Turns out success doesn't feel the way you think it's going to feel. When you've spent your whole life being told you're destined for greatness? I leaned forward, genuinely confused. David, you have everything going for you. Great career, beautiful wife, financial security, Mom and Dad's complete approval. What could you possibly have to be anxious about? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's exactly the problem. Marcus, I have everything I'm supposed to want. Everything that should make me happy, and I feel empty. I feel like a fraud who's been playing a role for so long that I've forgotten who I actually am. Underneath it all, David handed me the therapy notes. Dr. Martinez says I have what she calls imposter syndrome combined with achievement anxiety. Basically, I'm terrified that someone's going to figure out that I'm not as smart or capable as everyone thinks I am, and I'm addicted to external validation because I don't have any sense of internal worth. I read through the notes, seeing my brother's struggles laid out in clinical language that somehow made them more real and more heartbreaking. Session number 8, patient reports feeling overshadowed by brother's genuine heroism. Struggles with the realization that his corporate achievements feel hollow compared to brother's life-saving work. David, I said softly, I had no idea you felt this way. How could you? I've spent years presenting this perfect image, being the son Mom and Dad wanted, achieving all the things that were supposed to matter. But Marcus, when Colonel Harrison talked about what you did in Afghanistan, when he described the lives you've saved and the respect you've earned, I realized something that's been eating at me ever since. He took back the notes and found a specific page. Here's session number 10. I told Dr. Martinez that I've never done anything in my life that actually mattered. I've made money for rich people. I've climbed corporate ladders. I've impressed people at cocktail parties. But I've never saved a life. I've never put myself at risk for someone else. I've never done anything that would matter if I died tomorrow. The admission hung between us like a confession. Here was David, the brother I'd envied for his effortless success, telling me that he envied me. You want to know the really pathetic part? David continued. I've been jealous of you for years. Jealous of your sense of purpose, your clear mission, your ability to know exactly who you are and what you're supposed to be doing. While I've been climbing corporate ladders and accumulating achievements that feel meaningless, you've been out. They're actually making a difference. I set down the therapy notes, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath our entire relationship. David, you could have told me this. We could have talked about it. How? How do you tell your brother who's been dismissed and overlooked by your parents that you're jealous of his life? How do you admit that all the success and recognition you've received feels empty, when he's been fighting for scraps of approval his whole life? David was right, and we both knew it. The family dynamics that had marginalized my achievements had also trapped him in a role he'd never chosen, burdened with expectations that had nothing to do with what actually made him happy. There's more, David said, turning to another page in the notes. Session number 15. Patient admits to intentionally downplaying brother's military achievements to parents and friends. Reports guilt about contributing to family's dismissive attitude toward brother's service. I looked up at him sharply. You intentionally downplayed my service? David nodded, his face flushed with shame. Not maliciously, but yeah. When you'd call with news about promotions or awards, I'd kind of brush it off when Mom and Dad brought it up later. I'd say things like Marcus seems to be doing well instead of emphasizing how significant your achievements were. Why? Because I was threatened, he admitted. Because for the first time in my life, you were excelling at something I couldn't do, something that mattered more than anything I'd ever accomplished. I was the smart brother, the successful brother, the one who made our parents proud. But you were the brave brother, the heroic brother, the one who actually saved lives. David pulled out another note. Dr. Martinez helped me realize that I've been using our parents' approval as a way to avoid confronting my own insecurities. As long as they were focused on my achievements and dismissive of yours, I didn't have to face the fact that your work has real meaning while mine feels like an elaborate game. The therapy notes painted a picture of a man who had everything and felt like he had nothing, who had spent his life accumulating external validation while watching his brother find genuine purpose. It was a perspective I'd never considered that David's success might be as much a burden as a blessing. Marcus, I owe you a huge apology, David said. Not just for the past few weeks, but for years of allowing our parents to diminish your achievements while I soaked up praise for things that don't matter nearly as much as what you do. I studied my brother's face, seeing vulnerability there. I'd never noticed before. David, you don't need to apologize for being successful, and you don't need to feel guilty about our parents' approval. That's not your fault. But I could have done more to make them see what you were accomplishing. I could have challenged their assumptions instead of reinforcing them. I could have been a better brother. The therapy notes revealed another layer of our family dysfunction, not just that my achievements had been dismissed, but that David had been trapped in a role that was slowly suffocating him. We'd both been victims of the same narrow definition of success, just from opposite sides. You know what's funny? I said, trying to process this new understanding of our relationship. I spent years wishing I could be more like you. Confident, successful, making our parents proud. I never imagined you might be struggling with any of this. That's because I got really good at hiding it, David replied. Golden children aren't allowed to have doubts or insecurities. We're supposed to be grateful for all the attention and approval, not question whether we deserve it or whether it means anything. I looked at the therapy notes again, seeing session after session where David had worked through his feelings about our family dynamics, his career, his sense of purpose. How long have you been feeling this way? Honestly, probably since college. Maybe earlier, but it got worse after you enlisted. Suddenly, there was this thing you were doing that I couldn't compete with, couldn't diminish, couldn't explain away. You were serving your country while I was writing marketing reports. You were saving lives while I was optimizing profit margins. David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the suburban street where we'd grown up. Do you remember? When we were kids and you used to talk about wanting to be a firefighter or a paramedic? Some job where you'd help people? I nodded. Mom and Dad always said those were nice dreams, but I should think about something more practical, right? And I remember thinking that your dreams were better than mine. You wanted to help people, and I just wanted to make money and impress people. But I was the one getting praised for having realistic goals while you were getting redirected towards something more sensible. The irony was painful. David had achieved everything our parents had wanted for both of us, but he'd lost himself. In the process, meanwhile, I'd chosen a path they'd disapproved of, but had found genuine purpose and meaning. Marcus, there's something else I need to tell you, David said, turning back from the window. When Colonel Harrison was talking about your service, about the lives you've saved and the respect you've earned, I felt something I've never felt before in my life. What's that? Pride in my brother? Real pride, not the kind of polite acknowledgement I'd been offering for years. For the first time, I understood that you'd found something I've been looking for my whole life: work that matters. A clear sense of purpose, the respect of people whose opinions actually count. David sat back down and pulled out one more note. From his therapy session, session number 18. Patient expresses desire to repair a relationship with brother and explore ways to find more meaningful work. Recognizes that brother's path, while different from his own, represents values patient wishes he'd pursued. Dr. Martinez suggested that maybe part of my anxiety comes from living a life that doesn't align with my actual values. David continued, I've been chasing money and status because that's what I thought success looked like. But you've been pursuing something more fundamental: service, courage, purpose. I felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. Sadness that my brother had been struggling with these feelings for years while I'd been too caught up in my own hurt to notice. Hope that maybe we could build a different kind of relationship going forward. David, it's not too late to change course, I said. You're 31 years old. You've got skills, education, financial security. If you want to do something more meaningful with your life, you can. I know. Dr. Martinez and I have been talking about that. Maybe pro bono legal work, maybe transitioning to a nonprofit, maybe using my business skills to help organizations that actually make a difference. The therapy notes had revealed something I'd never expected, that the brother I'd envied had been envying me right back. We'd both been trapped by our family's expectations, just in different ways. David had gotten the approval I'd craved, but at the cost of his own sense of authenticity and purpose. I want to do better, Marcus, David said, folding up the therapy notes. As a brother, as a son, as a person. I want to support your career instead of undermining it. I want to challenge our parents when they dismiss your achievements. I want to be someone you can actually be proud to call your brother. I reached over and gripped his shoulder. David, I've always been proud to call you my brother. I just wished you felt the same way about me. I do now, and I should have said it years ago. The therapy sessions would continue, David told me, as he worked through years of performance anxiety and imposter syndrome. But this conversation marked a turning point in our relationship the moment we stopped competing for our parents' approval and started supporting each other's actual dreams and values. The notes went back into David's wallet, but the honesty they'd prompted remained between us. For the first time in our adult lives, we were seeing each other clearly, not as competition or comparison points, but as brothers who had both struggled to find their place in a family that had rigid ideas about success. David's confession didn't fix everything, but it helped me understand that the golden child's pedestal can be just as isolating as being overlooked. We'd both paid a price for our family's narrow definition of achievement, and now we could work together to build something healthier for both of us. The military casualty report arrived in my mother's email inbox on a Thursday morning. 3 weeks after Colonel Harrison's visit had turned our family upside down, she'd started subscribing to military news feeds and veterans organizations' newsletters, trying to understand the world her son inhabited, but she wasn't prepared for this particular piece of reality. Specialist James McKinney, 23, of Phoenix, Arizona, was killed in action during combat operations in Afghanistan, the report began. McKinney was serving as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division when his unit came under enemy fire during a patrol in Kandahar province. My mother called me immediately, her voice shaking. Marcus, I just read about a soldier who was killed. A medic, like you. He was only 23 years old. I was at Fort Bragg, between training exercises, when her call came through. The name McKinney was familiar. He'd been in one of the units I'd worked with during my second deployment. Good kid, dedicated medic, someone who'd reminded me of myself when I was starting out. Yeah, Mom, I knew him. He was a good soldier. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for a long moment. When my mother spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus, that could have been you. Any of those reports I've been reading, they could have been about you. For the first time since I'd enlisted, my mother was confronting the reality of what military service actually meant. Not the abstract concept of serving your country that she'd politely acknowledged for years, but the concrete possibility that her son could come home in a flag-draped coffin. Mom, I know it's scary to think about. No, she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. No, I don't think you understand. I've been reading these reports for weeks now, ever since Colonel Harrison came to the house. Every casualty report, every story about wounded soldiers, every article about combat operations, and Marcus, I had no idea. I had no idea what you've been facing over there. She'd been doing research, she told me, not the casual Google searches she'd done in the past, but deep dives into military casualties, combat medicine, the realities of serving in a war zone. She'd read about IEDs and ambushes, about medics working under fire, about the psychological toll of seeing friends wounded and killed. I found a statistic, she continued, her voice growing steadier but more urgent. Do you know that combat medics have one of the highest casualty rates in the military? That they're specifically targeted by enemy fighters because treating them prevents soldiers from getting medical care. I did know that. Every medic knew that. It was part of the job, part of the calculated risk we accepted when we chose this path. But hearing my mother say it out loud was different. It meant she was finally understanding what I'd been living with for years. Marcus, I've been reading about soldiers with PTSD, about the suicide rates among veterans, about the long-term effects of multiple deployments. I've been reading about families who've lost sons and daughters, about the grief that never goes away. The McKinney casualty report had been the catalyst, but my mother's awakening had been building for weeks. Since Colonel Harrison's visit, she'd thrown herself into learning about military life with the same intensity she'd once applied to following David's corporate career. I read about a mother whose son was killed by an IED while treating wounded soldiers, she said. She said the hardest part wasn't just losing him, but realizing how little she'd understood about what he was doing, how much danger he'd been in, how important his work was to the men he served with. My mother started crying then, not the gentle tears she'd shed during Colonel Harrison's visit, but deep, wrenching sobs that spoke to years of accumulated guilt and fear. Marcus, I am so sorry. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry for not understanding, for not appreciating, for not being the mother you deserved while you were risking your life to serve your country. I found myself crying too, standing in a hallway at Fort Bragg with soldiers, walking past, trying to process this conversation I'd been waiting years to have. Mom, you don't need to apologize. Yes, I do, she said firmly. I need to apologize for treating your service like it was less important than David's job. I need to apologize for not educating myself about what you were doing, for not supporting you the way a military mother should support her son. She told me about the other research she'd been doing. She'd contacted the local VFW, asking how she could better support military families. She'd reached out to other military mothers, asking for advice about how to be a good parent to a soldier. She'd even attended a Gold Star Mothers meeting mothers who had lost children in military service to better understand the risks military families face. They were so kind to me, she said. These women who had lost their sons and daughters. They welcomed me and helped me understand what I should have known all along. They told me about the pride they felt in their children's service, about the honor of being a military family, about the sacrifice that military service represents. Casualty report that had triggered this conversation was still open on her computer, she told me. She'd printed it out and put it on her desk as a reminder of the realities I faced every day. I'm not going to pretend I'm not terrified for you, she said. Reading about soldiers like James McKinney, understanding what could happen, it scares me more than anything ever has. But Marcus, I'm also prouder of you than I've ever been of anything in my life. My mother had started keeping a folder of military news. She told me, not just the casualty reports, but stories of heroism, accounts of soldiers making a difference, articles about the importance of military service. She was building an education for herself about the world I'd chosen, trying to make up for years of willful ignorance. I've been reading about the soldiers you've saved, she continued. I found some of the online forums Colonel Harrison mentioned, where soldiers talk about medics they've served with. Marcus, there are men alive today because of you. Husbands who came home to their wives, fathers who came home to their children, sons who came home to their parents. The weight of that realization that my mother was finally understanding not just the risks I faced, but the importance of what I did, was overwhelming. I called Mrs. Chen, she said suddenly. Mrs. Chen, the mother of one of the soldiers you pulled out of that overturned vehicle. I found her contact information through the local veterans organization. I wanted to talk to someone whose son you'd saved. I was stunned. My mother had reached out to the family of a soldier I'd treated, wanting to understand the impact of my work from their perspective. She cried when I told her who I was. My mother continued. She said her son talks about you, about how you kept him calm during the evacuation, about how your confidence and skill made him believe he was going to be okay. Marcus, that woman considers you a hero because you brought her son home alive. The conversation continued for another hour, with my mother sharing what she'd learned about military life, combat medicine, and the realities of serving in Afghanistan. She'd educated herself not just about the dangers I faced, but about the honor and importance of military service. I'm going to do better, she promised before we hung up. I'm going to be the military mother I should have been from the beginning. I'm going to support you, advocate for you, and make sure everyone knows how proud I am of the man you've become. The casualty report about Specialist McKinney now sits in a frame on my mother's desk, next to photos of me in uniform and copies of my military awards. It serves as a reminder not just of the risks military families face, but of the importance of understanding and appreciating the service of our soldiers. My mother's awakening didn't happen overnight, but it was thorough and genuine. She'd finally educated herself about the world I'd chosen, and in doing so, she'd discovered a pride in my service that went deeper than any recognition she'd ever felt for corporate achievements or academic accomplishments. The fear would always be there. No military mother can completely escape the anxiety that comes with having a child in harm's way. But alongside the fear was a new understanding of what it meant to be a military family, and a determination to honor that reality with the respect and support it deserved. The military shadow box appeared in my father's workshop on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after Colonel Harrison's revelations had forced our family to confront the reality of my military service. I discovered it during my visit home when I went looking for him and found him hunched over his workbench, carefully arranging my medals and ribbons in a display case with the focused intensity he usually reserved for his most important business projects. "Dad, what are you doing?" He looked up, startled, then gestured at the shadow box with something approaching embarrassment. "I've been working on this for a few weeks, trying to put together a proper display of your military service. I had to research what everything meant, how it should be arranged, what order the ribbons go in." The shadow box was beautiful dark wood, with a glass front, lined with military blue fabric. My medals were arranged according to official precedence, with my silver star prominently displayed at the top. Below that were my bronze star, Army Commendation medals, campaign ribbons, and service awards, each positioned exactly as military regulations specified. I had to call the VFW to make sure I was doing it right, my father continued, his voice uncertain. Turns out there's a specific way these things are supposed to be displayed. I didn't want to dishonor your service by doing it wrong. I stared at the display, trying to process what I was seeing. My father, who had spent years dismissing my military career as a phase I'd grow out of, had invested weeks of time and considerable effort into creating a proper military display. More than that, he'd educated himself about military protocol to ensure he did it correctly. Dad, this is incredible. When did you start working on this? He set down the small screwdriver he'd been using to adjust a metal mounting. The day after, Colonel Harrison came to the house. I kept thinking about what he said, about how we should be proud of what you've accomplished. And I realized that I didn't even know what most of your medals were for. My father had done his research thoroughly. Next to each medal and ribbon was a small placard explaining what it recognized, not just the official names, but what the awards actually meant. The Silver Star placard read, "For gallantry in action, against an enemy of the United States, awarded for saving the lives of 13 soldiers under enemy fire in Afghanistan." I spent hours reading military websites, learning about the different awards, understanding what each one represents. He said, "Marcus, I had no idea how significant some of these are. The Silver Star is the third highest military decoration for valor. Only the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Cross rank higher." He pointed to another medal in the display. "This Bronze Star with the V device, that's for heroic achievement in combat, and this Army Commendation Medal with V device is for valor in a combat zone. Son, you've been decorated multiple times for courage under fire, and I never understood what that meant." My father had always been methodical in his approach to learning new things, but seeing him apply that same careful attention to my military service felt like a fundamental shift in our relationship. He wasn't just acknowledging my achievements, he was studying them, understanding them, respecting them. "There's something else," he said, pulling out a thick folder from his workbench drawer. "I've been researching military hierarchy, trying to understand what your rank means, what your responsibilities are, how the promotion system works." The folder contained printouts of military organizational charts, explanations of enlisted ranks, descriptions of combat medic duties, and even statistics about promotion rates and retention in the Army. My father had essentially enrolled himself in a self-directed course on military service. "I learned that Staff Sergeant is a significant achievement, especially at your age," he continued. "That most soldiers don't reach that rank until they've been in for 8 or 10 years, but you made it in 6. And the fact that you've been selected for the Non-Commissioned Officer Academy, that's a big deal, isn't it?" I nodded, touched that he'd taken the time to understand the significance of milestones I'd stopped trying to explain to him years ago. "Yeah, Dad, it is a big deal. I also researched combat medics specifically," he said, pulling out another section of his folder. "Did you know that medics have to complete some of the most demanding training in the military? That they have to master both combat skills and medical skills, that they're responsible for the lives of everyone in their unit." My father had discovered what I'd been trying to tell him for years, that being a combat medic wasn't just a job. It was a calling that required exceptional skill, courage, and dedication. He'd learned about the training pipeline, the responsibilities, the respect that medics earn from their fellow soldiers. "Marcus, I owe you a tremendous apology," he said, setting down the folder and looking directly at me. "I spent years thinking your military service was somehow less important than a civilian career. I thought you were wasting your potential, that you could be doing something more significant with your life." He gestured toward the shadow box. "But after learning what you actually do, what you've accomplished, what you've sacrificed, I understand now that I had it backwards. You found work that actually matters, work that saves lives and serves something bigger than yourself." The shadow box represented more than just a display of my medals. It represented my father's journey from dismissal to understanding to genuine pride. He'd taken the time to educate himself about military service, to understand the significance of my achievements, to respect the choices I'd made. "I've been talking to other fathers at work whose sons are in the military," he continued. "I'd never realized there was this whole community of military families, people who understand what you've been going through, what we've been missing as a family." My father had started attending a monthly support group for military families, he told me. He'd connected with other parents who had children in the service, learning from their experiences and perspectives. He'd even volunteered to help with a local veterans organization, using his business skills to support military families in the community. "I met a father whose son was killed in Iraq," he said quietly. "A Marine who died protecting his unit from an IED attack. That man told me something I'll never forget. He said the worst part wasn't just losing his son, but knowing that he'd never fully appreciated what his son was doing while he was alive." The conversation reminded me of my mother's reaction to the casualty report she'd read, but my father's response had been more practical, more systematic. Where my mother had experienced an emotional awakening, my father had undertaken an intellectual one, educating himself about every aspect of military service until he could truly understand what I'd chosen to do with my life. "The shadow box will go in the living room," he said, making a final adjustment to one of the metal mountings, right next to David's diplomas and awards. "Equal placement, equal recognition." The symbolism wasn't lost on me. For years, David's achievements had dominated the family's display of accomplishments, while my military service had been barely acknowledged. Now my father was literally giving my achievements equal standing, equal respect, equal pride of place. In the family home, "Dad, thank you," I said, meaning it more deeply than I could express. "This means everything to me." "It should have been done years ago," he replied. "You've been serving your country with distinction, earning the respect of your peers and superiors, saving lives under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. That deserves to be recognized and honored." The shadow box now hangs in my parents' living room, exactly where my father promised it would go. Visitors see it immediately when they enter the house, and my father makes sure to explain what each medal represents, what I've accomplished, why they should be proud to know a military family. His research folder has grown over the months, filled with articles about military service, stories of heroism, statistics about veterans, and information about military benefits and support services. He's become something of an expert on military affairs, able to discuss deployment cycles, military occupational specialties, and veteran issues with the knowledge of someone who's made it his business to understand. The transformation from dismissive parent to proud military father didn't happen overnight, but it was thorough and genuine. My father had applied the same methodical approach that had made him successful in business to understanding my military career, and in doing so, he'd discovered a pride in my service that went deeper than any achievement he'd celebrated before. The shadow box represents more than just military recognition. It represents a father's journey from ignorance to understanding, from disappointment to pride, from dismissal to respect. It's proof that it's never too late to learn, never too late to change, never too late to become the parent your child deserves. The key to the city sat heavy in my hands, its gold-plated surface catching the afternoon sunlight as Mayor Patricia Collins presented it to me on the steps of City Hall. Behind me stood my family, all of them. For the first time ever, at one of my ceremonies, my parents flanked me with expressions of unmistakable pride, while David and Rebecca held a professionally made banner reading "Welcome Home, Hero." "Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez represents the very best of our community," Mayor Collins announced to the gathered crowd of nearly 300 people. His courage in combat, his dedication to saving lives, and his commitment to serving something greater than himself exemplify the values we hold dear in our city. The ceremony had been planned for weeks, but I'd only learned about it 3 days earlier when Colonel Harrison called to tell me that my hometown wanted to honor my service. Apparently, word of my military achievements had spread through the community after local news outlets picked up the story of my family's newfound recognition of my service. "This is surreal," I whispered to David, who stood beside me in a suit that cost more than my monthly military pay. "Get used to it," he whispered back, grinning. "Mom's been telling everyone in town about your medals. Half the city knows your story by now." He wasn't exaggerating. In the weeks since my family's awakening, my mother had become something of a military advocate in our community. She'd spoken at the Rotary Club about supporting military families, written letters to the local newspaper about veteran services, and apparently convinced the mayor's office that I deserved public recognition. The crowd included faces I recognized from childhood, former teachers, neighbors, family friends who had watched me grow up, but there were also people I'd never met. Local veterans, active-duty military families, community leaders who had come to honor someone they'd only recently learned about. Mrs. Patterson, my high school guidance counselor, was in the front row. She'd been one of the people who gently suggested I consider more realistic career options when I'd talked about military service. Now she was applauding as the mayor described my combat achievements and the lives I'd saved. "Sergeant Rodriguez's actions in Afghanistan represent the highest traditions of American military service," Mayor Collins continued. "Under intense enemy fire, he repeatedly risked his own life to save his fellow soldiers. His bravery, skill, and dedication resulted in 13 soldiers returning home to their families, 13 families who will never have to experience the loss of a husband, son, brother, or father." The ceremony included testimonials from community members, including several I'd never expected to hear from. My old Little League coach spoke about the determination and teamwork I'd shown as a kid. The pastor from my family's church talked about service and sacrifice. Most surprisingly, my high school principal read a letter from several classmates who had tracked down my story and wanted to express their pride in serving in the same graduating class as a genuine American hero. But the most meaningful moment came when Colonel Harrison stepped to the microphone. He'd driven down specifically for the ceremony, bringing with him 2 soldiers I'd served with in Afghanistan. "I've had the privilege of serving with Sergeant Rodriguez through multiple deployments," Harrison began. "I've watched him perform under the most extreme circumstances, making life-and-death decisions while under enemy fire. But today, I want to talk about something else, the kind of man Marcus Rodriguez is when the shooting stops." Harrison described the mentorship I provided to younger soldiers, the way I volunteered for the most dangerous missions because I knew my skills might be needed, the calm leadership I demonstrated during emergencies. He talked about my reputation throughout the army as someone who could be counted on, someone who made everyone around him better. Marcus doesn't seek recognition, Harrison concluded. He's never promoted his own achievements or asked for special treatment. He simply does his job with excellence, dedication, and courage. This community should be proud to claim him as one of their own. After Harrison's remarks, something unexpected happened. Specialist Chun, one of the soldiers I'd pulled from the overturned vehicle in Kandahar, stepped forward. I hadn't seen him since our deployment ended, and I was shocked to discover he'd driven 8 hours to attend the ceremony. I'm alive today because of Sergeant Rodriguez, Chen said simply. When our vehicle was hit, when everything went wrong, he was the calm voice that kept me focused, the skilled hands that stopped my bleeding, the courage that got me out of that wreckage. Every day I've had since then, every sunrise, every conversation with my family, every moment of my life, I owe to him. The crowd was silent as Chen continued. People talk about heroes like they're somehow different from the rest of us, like they're born with something special. But Sergeant Rodriguez is a hero because he chose to be one, over and over again. In moments when it would have been easier and safer to make different choices, my mother was crying openly now. Not the quiet tears she'd shed during our family confrontations, but proud, joyful tears that spoke to a transformation in how she saw her son. My father stood at attention despite never having served in the military, showing the respect he'd learned to have for military ceremonies. The mayor presented the key to the city, along with a proclamation declaring Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez Day in our hometown. The proclamation detailed my service record, my combat achievements, and my contributions to the community's reputation for producing outstanding citizens. This key represents more than just recognition, Mayor Collins explained. It represents our community's gratitude for your service, our pride in your achievements, and our commitment to supporting you and all our military families. The ceremony concluded with a reception where community members could meet me personally and express their appreciation. The conversations were overwhelming. Parents of other deployed soldiers thanking me for representing their children well, veterans from previous conflicts welcoming me into their brotherhood, young people asking about military service and what it meant to serve. One conversation particularly stood out. An elderly man approached me with tears in his eyes, introducing himself as the father of a soldier killed in Vietnam. Son, I never got to see my boy recognized the way you're being recognized today, he said. But watching this ceremony, seeing how your community honors your service, it gives me some peace about what my son gave for his country. Thank you for helping people understand what military service really means. The local news coverage of the ceremony was extensive, with interviews featuring my family, Colonel Harrison, and several community members. For the first time, I watched my parents speak publicly about my military service with genuine pride and understanding. We always knew Marcus was special, my mother told the reporter, but we didn't fully understand the significance of what he was doing until recently. Now we realize we have a genuine hero in our family, and we couldn't be prouder. My father, who had always been more comfortable with financial achievements than military honors, spoke with the authority of someone who had educated himself thoroughly. Marcus has received some of the military's highest decorations for valor. He's saved lives under combat conditions, led soldiers through dangerous situations, and earned the respect of his peers and superiors. This recognition is long overdue. The key to the city now sits in a place of honor in my apartment, but copies of the ceremony photos hang in several locations: my parents' house, Colonel Harrison's office, and even the local VFW hall where it serves as inspiration for other military families. The ceremony represented more than just community recognition. It represented a complete transformation in how my hometown, my family, and I myself understood the value and significance of military service. For years, I'd served quietly, without fanfare or recognition beyond my immediate military community. Now, for the first time, that service was being celebrated in the place where I'd grown up, by people who had known me before I became a soldier. Mayor's proclamation declaring Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez Day was particularly meaningful because it established a permanent recognition of military service in my hometown. Future ceremonies would honor other local service members, and the community had committed to supporting military families in concrete ways. As I stood on those city hall steps, holding the key to the city while my family beamed with pride behind me, I realized that the recognition I'd craved for so long had finally arrived, not just from my family, but from the entire community that had watched me grow up. The boy who had struggled to find his place had become a man whose service was considered worthy of the highest civic honor his hometown could bestow. The applause that day wasn't just for my military achievements. It was for the journey that had brought me from being overlooked and dismissed to being celebrated and honored. It was recognition not just of what I'd accomplished, but of what I'd overcome to get there. The VA counseling appointment card was worn from being carried in my wallet for 6 months. Its edges frayed from nervous handling during the difficult period when I'd finally admitted that 3 deployments had left. Psychological scars that wouldn't heal on their own. When Dr. Sarah Martinez, not related to David's therapist, Though the coincidence had provided some family humor suggested family therapy sessions, I'd been skeptical. But sitting in her office with my parents and David, I realized how much we all needed this space to have conversations we'd avoided for years. PTSD doesn't just affect the veteran, Dr. Martinez explained to my family during our first session. Together it affects the entire family system, and in your case, there were relationship issues that existed before Marcus's deployments, which have been complicated by his combat experiences and your family's recent recognition of his service. My parents sat stiffly in their chairs, clearly uncomfortable with being in therapy, but committed to the process. David looked more at ease. His own therapy experience had prepared him for this kind of conversation. I felt exposed and vulnerable, but also hopeful that we might finally address the years of misunderstanding that had driven us apart. Marcus, Dr. Martinez began, can you help your family understand what PTSD looks like for you? Not the clinical definition, but your actual experience? I'd been dreading this question, but I knew it was necessary. It's not what people think from movies, I said, looking at my hands rather than my family. I don't have flashbacks where I think I'm back in Afghanistan. It's more subtle than that. I described the hypervigilance that made me scan every room for exits, the way loud noises could trigger an adrenaline response, the insomnia that came from years of sleeping lightly in case of emergency calls. I talked about the survivor's guilt that came from being alive when soldiers like McKinney hadn't made it home, and the isolation that came from feeling like no one understood what I'd experienced. The hardest part, I continued, is feeling disconnected from civilian life. Everything here seems so trivial compared to life and death situations. People complain about traffic or work stress, and I think about soldiers who are dealing with actual life-threatening situations every day. My mother leaned forward. Marcus, why didn't you tell us you were struggling with this? Because you weren't interested in my military experience when it was positive, I said gently, but honestly. You dismissed my achievements, my pride in my service, my sense of purpose. How could I share the difficult parts when you'd made it clear you didn't want to hear about any of it? Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's an important point. Marcus felt like he couldn't share his struggles because the family hadn't shown interest in his military life overall. Let's explore how that dynamic developed. What followed was the most honest conversation my family had ever had. My parents talked about their fears, their terror that I'd be killed or permanently damaged by military service, their desire to protect me from what they saw as unnecessary danger, their inability to understand why I'd chosen a path that seemed so risky when I had other options. We thought if we didn't encourage your military career, you might decide to do something safer, my father admitted. We were scared every day you were deployed, but we didn't know how to express that without seeming so we just avoided talking about it altogether, which made me feel like you didn't care. I responded, like my service didn't matter to you, like I didn't matter to you in the same way David did. David shifted uncomfortably. Marcus, I need to take responsibility for some of this too. I knew our parents were worried about you, and instead of helping them understand your achievements, I kind of reinforced their desire to downplay your military career. I thought I was protecting them from worry, but I was really protecting myself from feeling inadequate. Dr. Martinez helped us navigate these revelations, providing structure for conversations that could have easily devolved into accusations and defensiveness. She helped my parents understand how their fear-based responses had been interpreted as rejection, and she helped me understand that their dismissal of my service hadn't been about its value, but about their own anxiety and ignorance. Let's talk about the PTSD symptoms specifically, Dr. Martinez suggested. Marcus, when do they tend to be worst? During transitions, I admitted. Coming home from deployment is always hard because everything feels so different, but also during family gatherings. Honestly, being around people who don't understand military life, who ask surface-level questions about my service but don't really want to hear the answers, it makes me feel more isolated. My mother looked stricken. Our family gatherings made your PTSD worse, not worse, exactly, but they highlighted the disconnect between my military life and my family life. I'd come home from deployments where I'd been treating combat casualties and leading soldiers, and you'd ask how I was doing, in the same tone you'd use to ask about a vacation. Dr. Martinez turned to my parents. How did Marcus's homecomings typically go? We were always so relieved to have him home safe, my mother said. We wanted to celebrate that he was okay, but we also wanted to avoid talking about anything that might upset him. So we kept things light and focused on family news instead of his experiences, which made me feel like you were relieved I was done with military nonsense for a while, rather than proud of what I'd accomplished. I added. The therapy sessions continued weekly for 2 months, each one peeling back another layer of misunderstanding and hurt. We talked about the pressure David had felt to be the perfect son, the way my parents' own upbringing had shaped their ideas about success and security, and the cultural disconnect between civilian and military life that many families struggle with. One of the most difficult sessions involved discussing specific combat experiences that had affected me. Dr. Martinez helped me explain the weight of medical decision-making under fire, the responsibility of keeping soldiers alive, and the psychological impact of seeing young men wounded and killed. I need you to understand that my PTSD isn't just about the danger I faced, I told my family. It's also about the responsibility I carried. When someone gets hurt, when someone dies, you always wonder if you could have done something different, something better. That weight doesn't go away when you come home. My father asked questions I'd never expected from him. Marcus, how do you cope with that kind of responsibility? How do you function knowing that people's lives depend on your decisions? Training helps, I said. But honestly, the support of fellow soldiers is what makes it bearable. Knowing that other people understand what you're going through, that they trust your abilities, that they've got your back, that's what keeps you sane. And you never felt like you had that support from us, my mother said quietly. No, I felt like I had to hide that part of my life from you because it made you uncomfortable. Dr. Martinez helped us develop new patterns of communication. My parents learned to ask specific, informed questions about my military life rather than generic inquiries. They started reading military news and veteran resources so they could better understand my experiences. Most importantly, they learned to express pride in my service rather than just relief at my safety. I want to understand your work better, my mother said during one session. Not just the dangerous parts, but the medical training, the leadership responsibilities, the daily routine. I want to know what your life is actually like. David worked on his own issues with our family therapist, but he also started attending some of our family sessions. He talked about his plans to transition to more meaningful work, his desire to use his business skills to help veteran organizations, and his newfound respect for my choice to prioritize service over financial success. I've been thinking about what you said about purpose, David told me during one session. I want to find work that matters the way yours does. Maybe not life and death situations, but something that makes a real difference. The therapy sessions also addressed practical issues. Dr. Martinez helped my family understand that my hypervigilance and sleep issues were normal responses to combat stress, not signs of weakness or permanent damage. She taught them how to support me during difficult periods without treating me like I was fragile or broken. PTSD is manageable, she explained to them. With proper treatment, support, and understanding, veterans with PTSD can lead full, successful lives. The key is having a support system that understands the challenges and knows how to help. One of the most healing moments came when my father asked if he could attend a veteran support group meeting with me. I want to meet other military fathers, he said. I want to learn from people who've been supporting military children longer than I have. A support group meeting was eye-opening for my father. He met parents who had navigated multiple deployments, who had lost children in combat, who had learned to balance pride in their children's service with natural parental worry. He came home with a completely different perspective on military families and his role as a military parent. I met a father whose son has been deployed 6 times, he told the family afterward. He said the hardest part wasn't the worry, it was learning to be proud instead of just scared. He said fear is natural, but it shouldn't overshadow the honor of having a child who serves. The VA counseling appointment card that had started this journey eventually became worn beyond use, replaced by regular therapy appointments that helped me manage my PTSD symptoms while rebuilding my relationship with my family. But therapy wasn't a magic cure. Family dynamics that took years to develop don't change overnight. But it provided a framework for honest communication and mutual understanding that had been missing for too long. Dr. Martinez's final session with our family focused on moving forward. You've done the hard work of acknowledging past hurts and misunderstandings, she told us. Now the challenge is building new patterns that honor both Marcus's military service and your family bonds. The healing conversations that began in Dr. Martinez's office continued in our daily lives. My parents started asking different questions during our phone calls, sharing articles about military issues they'd read, and including military-related topics in their conversations with friends and family. David began volunteering with a nonprofit that helped veterans transition to civilian careers, finding purpose in work that connected to my military experience. Most importantly, we all learned that healing from PTSD and healing from family dysfunction weren't separate processes, they were interconnected challenges that required commitment, understanding, and professional guidance to address effectively. The therapy sessions had given us tools for communication, understanding, and support that we'd lacked before. They'd helped us transform from a family divided by misunderstanding into a family united by respect, even when that respect had been hard-won and long overdue. The military challenge coin from Colonel Harrison sat in the center of my parents' dining room table like a small monument to transformation. It was Thanksgiving, 8 months after that life-changing homecoming gathering, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt truly welcomed at a family celebration. The coin, Harrison's personal command coin, given to me after our last deployment, together now occupied a place of honor that had once been reserved for elaborate centerpieces and formal table settings. "Tell us about this one again," my cousin Sarah asked, picking up the coin to examine its weight and craftsmanship. "Uncle Jim said it's really special." My father, who had become something of an expert on military traditions, answered before I could. "That's Colonel Harrison's personal challenge coin. Commanders only give those to soldiers who have truly earned their respect. Marcus received it after their final deployment together, along with a commendation for exceptional leadership. Under combat conditions, I watched my family's faces as my father explained the significance of challenge coins in military culture, how they represented brotherhood and recognition that couldn't be bought or faked. 6 months ago, none of them would have known what a challenge coin was, much less understood its importance to military families. "Marcus," my Aunt Linda said, "would you tell us about that deployment? I know it was your third one, but we've never really heard the details." This was new territory. For years, family gatherings had been exercises in polite avoidance of my military service. Questions about my deployments were generic and brief, designed more to show appropriate interest than to generate actual understanding. Now my family was asking for stories, details, real insight into my military life. It was different from the first two, I began, settling into my chair and realizing I was actually comfortable sharing these experiences with them. By then, I was a senior enlisted soldier with leadership responsibilities. I wasn't just treating patients, I was training younger medics, making decisions about evacuation priorities, coordinating with multiple units. I told them about the forward operating base where we'd been stationed, the mix of routine medical care and emergency trauma that defined our days, the satisfaction of mentoring soldiers who reminded me of myself when I'd first deployed. I described the challenges of combat medicine, the split-second decisions that determined whether someone lived or died, the weight of responsibility that came with being the person everyone counted on in medical emergencies. The hardest part, I continued, wasn't the danger, although that was always present. It was the knowledge that every decision I made had consequences for real people, soldiers who wanted to go home to their families, who trusted me to take care of them when they were at their most vulnerable. My mother, who had spent months educating herself about military medicine, asked informed questions about my training, my equipment, my protocols for different types of injuries. David wanted to know about the leadership aspects of my role, how I'd learned to manage teams under extreme stress, how I'd developed the confidence to make critical decisions quickly. "It sounds like a tremendous amount of responsibility for someone your age," Rebecca observed. "How do you learn to handle that kind of pressure?" "You learn by doing it," I said, "but also by being part of a team where everyone understands the stakes in combat. You can't afford to second-guess yourself or hesitate when someone needs help. You have to trust your training, trust your team, and act." The conversation flowed naturally, with family members asking follow-up questions, sharing their own perspectives, and connecting my military experiences to challenges they'd faced in their own lives. It felt like the kind of conversation I'd always wanted to have with them, one where my military service was treated as interesting, valuable, and worthy of respect rather than something to be politely tolerated. "Marcus," my grandfather said, speaking up from his usual spot at the head of the table, "I served in Korea, and I've never talked much about it with the family. But listening to you tonight, I realize I should have. There's something important about sharing these experiences with people who care about you." Grandpa had been largely silent about his own military service throughout my childhood, mentioning it only in passing and never in detail. Now, inspired by our family's new openness about military life, he began sharing stories I'd never heard before. "The thing about military service," he continued, "is that it changes you in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't been through it. You learn things about yourself, about leadership, about courage that you can't learn anywhere else. Marcus, what you've accomplished, the lives you've saved, the respect you've earned, that's something to be proud of for the rest of your life." The challenge coin passed from hand to hand around the table, each family member examining it with the kind of respect they'd once reserved for David's corporate awards. But this was different. This represented something earned through danger and sacrifice, something that couldn't be replicated in the civilian world. "We want to establish some new family traditions," my mother announced as we moved to dessert. "Ways to honor Marcus's service and support other military families in our community." She explained that my parents had decided to sponsor a local military family during the holidays, providing gifts and support for children whose parents were deployed. They'd also committed to volunteering with the Veterans Organization at the VA hospital, using their professional skills to help veterans navigate benefits and employment opportunities. We realized we'd been focusing so much on academic and professional achievements that we'd forgotten about service achievements. My father added, "We want to make sure we're celebrating all kinds of success in this family, including the kind that saves lives and serves our country." David had news of his own to share. "I've been working with a nonprofit that helps veterans transition to civilian careers. They're offering me a position as their director of corporate partnerships, using my business background to connect veterans with employment opportunities. The career change represented a significant sacrifice in terms of salary and prestige, but David seemed more excited about this opportunity than any of his previous promotions. "I want to do work that matters," he said, glancing at me. "Marcus showed me what it looks like to find purpose in your career, and I want to find my own version of that." As the evening continued, we established other new traditions. My parents would attend military ceremonies and events when possible, showing support for the military community that had embraced their son. We would have regular family conversations about current military operations and veteran issues, staying informed about the challenges facing military families. Most importantly, we would make space for military stories and experiences in our family gatherings, treating them as valued parts of our family history. "I have something for you," I told my family, pulling out a small wrapped package. Inside was a framed photo from my last deployment tower medical team standing in front of our aid station, tired but proud after a particularly challenging period. "These are my brothers," I said, pointing to each soldier in the photo and sharing a brief story about them. "They're the family that taught me what it means to have each other's backs, what it means to be proud of service, what it means to support each other through difficult times." I looked around the table at my actual family parents who had learned to respect my choices, a brother who had found his own path to meaningful work, extended family members who were asking genuine questions and showing real interest in my military life. "But I want you to know," I continued, "that having both families, my military family and my actual family, finally understanding and supporting each other means everything to me. I never thought I'd have this, and I'm grateful that we found our way here." The challenge coin returned to its place of honor, in the center of the table, where it would remain throughout the meal and beyond. My parents had decided it would be a permanent part of their holiday table settings, a reminder of their son's service and their family's commitment to honoring that service appropriately. As we cleaned up after dinner, working together in the kitchen like we had when I was young, I realized that we'd finally become the family I'd always hoped we could be. Not perfect, and not without our challenges, but honest, supportive, and unified in our respect for each other's choices and achievements. The new traditions we established that Thanksgiving would continue for years to come, creating space for military experiences in our family narrative, and ensuring that future generations would understand the value and honor of military service. The challenge coin would serve as a tangible reminder of the transformation our family had undergone, proof that it's never too late to change, never too late to learn, and never too late to become the family your children deserve. Colonel Harrison's coin represented more than just military recognition. It represented a family's journey from misunderstanding to respect, from division to unity, from disappointment to pride. And at every future family gathering, it would occupy that place of honor, reminding us all of the son and brother who had found his calling in service to others. The engagement ring gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as I knelt in the park where Alina and I had shared our first official date as civilians. She'd been an Army nurse practitioner when we met during my final deployment. Someone who understood the weight of military service and the challenges of transitioning to civilian life. Now, 18 months later, I was asking her to marry me with the full support and enthusiasm of a family that had learned to celebrate love and commitment in all its forms. "Marcus Rodriguez," she said, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the ring. "Are you seriously proposing to me in your dress uniform?" I grinned, adjusting my position slightly. The uniform had been my mother's suggestion. She'd insisted that this moment should honor both my military service and my future as a civilian. "Elena Martinez, will you marry me and help me figure out what comes next in our lives?" "Yes, you incredible man. Yes, absolutely yes." As I slipped the ring onto her finger, I could see my family watching from a discreet distance, having conspired with me to capture this moment while giving us space for privacy. The Alina they were witnessing wasn't just my girlfriend. She was someone who had served alongside me, who understood the bond between soldiers, who could bridge the gap between my military identity and my civilian future. The ring itself told a story of transformation. Instead of a traditional diamond, Alina had specifically requested something that reflected our shared military experience. The center stone was a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds arranged in a pattern that mimicked the medical corps insignia we'd both worn. It was beautiful, meaningful, and completely unlike anything my family would have expected me to choose years earlier. She said yes. I called out to my family, who immediately converged on us with congratulations, hugs, and the kind of enthusiastic celebration they'd once reserved exclusively for David's milestones. "Alina, welcome to the family," my mother said, embracing her future daughter-in-law with genuine warmth. "We've been hoping Marcus would propose for months now. He's been carrying that ring around like it was going to disappear if he left it at home." My father shook Elena's hand with the formal respect he'd learned to show for military personnel, then surprised both of us by pulling her into a hug. "We're honored to welcome another veteran into our family. Marcus tells us you're planning to work at the VA hospital." Alina nodded, still wiping happy tears from her eyes. "I want to continue serving veterans, helping them transition back to civilian life. There's such a need for medical professionals who understand military culture and combat-related health issues." David and Rebecca joined the celebration, and I watched my brother genuinely connect with Alina over their shared interest in helping veterans. His nonprofit work had given him insights into the challenges military families faced, and he was full of questions about our plans to work in veteran healthcare. Marcus is lucky to have found someone who understands his service, David said, and we're lucky to have you joining our family. Someone who can help us continue learning about military life and how to support veterans in our community. The engagement represented more than just Alina and me deciding to build a life together. It represented my family's complete embrace of my identity as a veteran, and their commitment to supporting military families in concrete ways. The enthusiasm they showed for Alina, the respect they demonstrated for her service, the genuine interest they expressed in her career plans, all of it reflected the transformation they'd undergone in the past year. As we celebrated that afternoon, Alina shared her own story of family challenges around military service. Her parents had been supportive but worried, struggling to understand why their daughter chose military nursing over civilian healthcare with better pay and less danger. It took them a while to realize that military service isn't about choosing the easy path, she explained to my parents. It's about choosing the path that serves something bigger than yourself. Marcus helped me see that my parents' concerns came from love, not lack of respect for my choices. My mother nodded knowingly. We made that same mistake. We thought we were protecting Marcus by discouraging his military career, but we were really just showing that we didn't understand or respect what he was doing. The conversation that followed was remarkable for its honesty and depth. My parents shared their journey from dismissal to understanding, describing the research they'd done, the veterans they'd met, the ways their perspective on military service had completely changed. Alina talked about her own family's evolution from worry to pride, from seeing military nursing as dangerous to recognizing it as essential. The beautiful thing, Alina said, taking my hand, is that Marcus and I both found families that learned to support our choices. That's not something every military couple can say. We spent the rest of the afternoon discussing wedding plans, and I was struck by how different this conversation was from the planning for David's wedding years earlier. Instead of focusing primarily on social status and appearances, my family was interested in creating a ceremony that honored our military service and reflected our values. We could have the ceremony at the base chapel, my father suggested. I've been reading about military weddings, and there are some beautiful traditions we could incorporate. Alina and I exchanged glances, both touched by his genuine enthusiasm for military customs he'd known nothing about a year earlier. We'd love that, Alina said. A military wedding would be perfect. My mother had already started researching military wedding traditions, she told us. She'd learned about the saber arch ceremony, where couples walk under crossed swords or sabers, held by fellow service members. She'd discovered military cake-cutting traditions, special protocols for inviting commanding officers, and ways to honor fallen soldiers during the ceremony. I want to make sure we do everything correctly, she said. This wedding should reflect the pride we feel in both of your service and the respect we have for military traditions. The engagement party my parents threw the following month was a perfect example of how much had changed in our family dynamics. The guest list included not just family and civilian friends, but also several of my fellow veterans, Alina's military colleagues, and members of the veterans organizations my parents had become involved with. Colonel Harrison attended, bringing with him a gift that moved both Alina and me to tears, a framed copy of the citation from the Kandahar incident, signed by all the soldiers whose lives I'd saved that day. This represents the brotherhood you're joining, Alina, he told her. These men consider Marcus family, and now they'll consider you family too. The speeches that night reflected the new understanding and respect my family had developed for military service. My father spoke about the pride he felt in having not one but two veterans in the family, and the lessons they'd taught him about courage, service, and genuine achievement. David talked about how my military career had inspired him to seek more meaningful work, and how Elena's example showed him that purpose could be found in service to others. A year ago, David said, raising his glass, I thought success was measured in salary figures and job titles. Marcus and Alina have shown me that real success is measured in lives touched, problems solved, and service rendered to something bigger than yourself. My mother's speech was the most emotional, describing her journey from worry and misunderstanding to pride and advocacy. I used to fear Marcus's military service, she admitted. Now I understand that his service, and Elena's service, represents the best of what our country can produce. We're not just gaining a daughter, we're gaining another hero. As Alina and I planned our transition to civilian life, I'd decided to leave active duty and become an EMT with the local fire department, while Alina pursued her job at the hospital. My family offered support and encouragement that felt genuine and informed. They understood the challenges of military to civilian transition because they'd educated themselves about veteran issues. They respected our choices because they'd learned to value service over salary. I'm proud of both of you for choosing careers that continue your service in civilian life, my father said during one family dinner. EMT work and veteran healthcare are logical extensions of what you've been doing in the military. Your true to your values, while building civilian careers? The Ring-Alina War had become a conversation starter in our community, with people asking about its unique design and the story behind it. Each conversation was an opportunity to talk about military service, veteran issues, and the importance of supporting military families. Conversations my family now participated in with knowledge and enthusiasm. Our wedding, held 6 months later, at the base chapel with full military honors, was everything we'd hoped for and more. The saber arch was performed by 8 of my fellow veterans, including several soldiers whose lives I'd saved during various deployments. Elena's nursing colleagues formed their own honor guard, and Colonel Harrison officiated the ceremony as an ordained minister. And our commanding officer, my parents participated in every aspect of the wedding planning and ceremony, treating it with the same importance and enthusiasm they'd once reserved for David's achievements. They learned military customs, researched appropriate gifts for military weddings, and invited their friends to witness and celebrate our commitment to each other and to continued service. The transformation was complete. From a family that had dismissed military service as a temporary phase, to a family that celebrated it as a calling. From parents who had worried about my choices, to parents who advocated for veterans in their community. From siblings who had competed for approval to siblings who supported each other's different definitions of success. The engagement ring represents more than Elena's and my commitment to each other. It represents my family's commitment to understanding, respecting, and supporting the choices we've made. It's proof that families can change, that understanding can replace ignorance, and that love can grow into respect when people are willing to do the hard work of learning and growing. As Elena and I build our civilian life together, surrounded by a family that finally understands and celebrates our military service, I'm reminded that some stories have endings better than anything you could have imagined at the beginning. The boy who felt like just a grunt became a man whose service was honored, whose choices were respected, and whose family learned to be proud of the hero they'd raised without even knowing it. The ring gleams on Elena's finger as she treats veterans at the VA hospital, just as my EMT badge gleams on my uniform as I respond to emergencies in our community. We're both still serving, still making a difference, still living the values that first drew us to military service. And for the first time in my life, my family understands and celebrates exactly what that means.